Silent words carry weight. There are words you've never said, words you locked in your throat when the moment passed, words that clawed at your tongue but died in silence. You told yourself they didn't matter, that what isn't spoken can't hurt. But you were wrong, because the unsaid doesn't vanish. It waits. It settles into the marrow of your bones like dust into the crevices of a forgotten room. And over time, those silent phrases begin to weigh more than the loudest screams you've ever released. Think back. Not to the conversations you remember clearly, but to the ones that never happened. The apology you rehearsed but never gave. The truth you softened into a lie. The feeling you swallowed because the timing was wrong, or the other person wasn't ready, or maybe you weren't. Those are the moments that shape us, far more than we like to admit. There's a myth we tell ourselves, that words must be heard to hold power. But some of the most destructive sentences in existence were never voiced aloud. I don't love you anymore. I wish I had tried harder. I'm not okay. I need help. The moment they form in the mind but not the mouth, they start to echo, not outward, but inward. They ripple through the psyche, bouncing off the walls of our private world, reshaping how we see ourselves, how we trust others, and how we define the limits of what we deserve. Every time you censor your truth to avoid rejection, you teach yourself that your truth is dangerous. Every time you hold back your hurt so as not to make a scene, you internalize the idea that your pain is an inconvenience. And every time you don't say what matters, the silence teaches you that your voice does not. What begins as restraint becomes erasure. Eventually, you forget what it was you wanted to say in the first place, but not the way it made you feel. The emotional residue outlives the memory, and you're left responding to shadows of sentences, triggered by something small, something random. A smell, a song, a laugh that sounds too much like the one you used to hear. Unspoken words don't die, they metastasize. In dreams, in anxiety, in sudden moments of anger that seem out of proportion. You're not lashing out at the moment. You're bleeding from the buildup, from years of quiet suffocation, from every moment you taught yourself to stay silent when you should have shaken the world. Sometimes, the most devastating conversations happen entirely inside us. We debate, we argue, we beg for forgiveness, imagining the responses we'll never receive. Whole lifetimes of dialogue unfold in the theater of our skulls, and no one else even knows, because on the outside, we smile. We nod, we say, it's fine, but inside, entire novels rot unwritten. You become a library of silence, and here's the hardest truth. The people around you, the ones you love, they don't carry your silence for you. They don't even know it exists. They walk through life responding to what you say, not what you meant to. They love a version of you that was edited for comfort and survival, and that disconnect, it grows. Until one day you realize no one truly knows you, not because they didn't care, but because you never let them. And that's when the silence becomes a cage, not one built by others, but one you constructed, brick by quiet brick, from all the words you were too afraid to speak. But this isn't about blame, it's about awareness. Because if you look closely, some of the strongest people you know are silent not out of peace, but exhaustion. Out of fear that their truth will be too much, or worse, not enough. People who've swallowed so much of their story that even they forget what the original narrative was. We are all carrying sentences that never saw daylight. A mother who never said, I regret some of my choices. A son who never said, I needed more from you. A lover who never said, I stayed because I was afraid of who I'd be alone. These are the quiet truths that shape destinies. And they're not poetic, they're corrosive. Because when unspoken, they make us act in ways we don't understand. We sabotage intimacy. We chase validation. We fear closeness while craving it. All because a sentence we never voiced years ago is still echoing like a ghost in the hallway of the heart. So ask yourself, what have you not said? What truth is curled inside you like a sleeping animal, claws tucked in, but ready to tear through everything the moment it's awakened? And more importantly, what would your life look like if you finally said it? Because sometimes, healing doesn't come from finding the right answer. It comes from finally asking the question out loud, and not in your head. Not through a text drafted and deleted, not in a poem no one will read, but in your voice, your breath, your trembling, flawed, terrified human voice. Because silence is seductive. It lets you avoid conflict, avoid shame, avoid the unknown. But it also ensures that you avoid yourself. There's a cost to every unsaid thing, and the bill always comes due. So speak. Even if your voice shakes, even if your timing is terrible, even if the words sound awkward and strange and raw, because at least then, the weight you carry will finally have somewhere to land besides your chest. You deserve to be known. You deserve to be heard. Not just for what you say, but for what you've held in for far too long. So don't let your story be written in silence. Let it be spoken, piece by piece, no matter how small, how broken, how late. Because even the quietest words, once freed, can shift the course of everything. Names devour their subjects. Every time you name something, truly name it, you begin the quiet act of killing it. Not in the way that fire consumes wood or rust eats through iron, but in a slower, more invisible way. Like a butterfly pinned in glass, still beautiful, still intact, but no longer alive. The name becomes the pin. The subject becomes the specimen. And what you gain in clarity, you lose in essence. This is the paradox of language. It is our most sacred gift and our most subtle curse. We use words to connect, to make sense, to remember. But words are not neutral. Every time you call a thing by its name, you flatten its wildness. You take the jagged, infinite tangle of what it could be and file it down to a single smooth handle you can grasp. And that handle, it fits so well in the palm that you forget it was once part of a storm. Take something simple, a tree. Before you knew the word tree, what was it? A colossal creature of wood and time, whispering in winds, bending with storms, a living monument that stretches both above and beneath the earth. But now you see a tree, just a word, a label, a category. You no longer feel its quiet violence, its desperate hunger for light, its patient growth through centuries of frost and drought. You no longer remember that a tree is not a thing, but an event, a living process unfurling over time. The name stole the becoming and replaced it with being. Now think of people. When you label someone, friend, enemy, lover, stranger, you wrap them in a net of assumptions. You say, I know what you are. But no person can be known that easily. Every human is a universe of contradictions, impulses, memories they don't even recall. But when you give them a name, mother, boss, criminal, genius, you no longer see their texture. You only see the category. You stop looking, you stop listening, you stop learning. And they, in your mind, stop growing. This is why names are so powerful, because they don't just describe, they define. They become reality. The moment you name something, you stop experiencing it directly. You begin experiencing your idea of it, a secondhand version, a concept wearing the skin of the real thing. This is why mystics in nearly every spiritual tradition warn against the power of naming. They say the divine cannot be named. They say truth cannot be spoken. Because the moment you say God, you've already lost what you meant. The word draws borders around something that has none. The word replaces the wonder with a placeholder. And this isn't just spiritual, it's neurological. In cognitive science, there's a phenomenon called semantic satiation. If you repeat a word enough times, it begins to lose its meaning. Say apple 50 times, and eventually it becomes a hollow sound, stripped of fruit, taste, memory. What's fascinating is that the opposite is also true. If you only say a word once, if you only ever encounter a thing through its name, you will never truly experience it at all. We do this with feelings. You say sad and think you've captured the experience, but the word sad doesn't contain the thousands of shades it represents. The ache behind your eyes, the quiet tremor in your voice, the memory that returns without knocking. You say happy, but do you mean the warmth of the sun on your skin, or the rush of finishing something difficult, or the deep peace of knowing someone understands you? These are not the same, yet they are all compressed into one thin word. So language does not just name reality, it distorts it, and yet we can't escape it. We are creatures of language. Without names, the world becomes chaos. Without categories, we drown in sensation. Without symbols, we cannot think. So we are forced to live in this contradiction. We must use names, even though they betray what they describe. We must speak, knowing every word is a kind of theft. But there's something we can do. We can remember. We can remember that every name we speak is a mask, not a face, a finger pointing, not the moon. We can look past the label and ask again, what is this, really? What am I not seeing because I think I already know? When you meet someone new, try this. Forget their title, forget their age, forget the story they give you. Just watch, listen. Notice the way they choose words, the rhythm of their breathing, the things they don't say, and slowly the idea of who they are will melt, and something real will start to shine through. When you walk through the world, don't just see cars, dogs, buildings, clouds. Try for a moment to strip away the words, see without naming, feel without classifying. You'll notice something strange happen. Reality begins to feel more alive. The world, unnamed, pulses with mystery again. It's not that language is the enemy, but it's a tool. And like all tools, it can become dangerous when we forget it's only a tool. A map is not the terrain. A diagnosis is not a soul. A description is not the experience. A name is not the thing. In fact, every time you name something, you're not just defining it. You're defining yourself. Because your labels reveal what matters to you, what you choose to notice, what you choose to ignore. If you call someone arrogant, is it because they truly are, or because you're uncomfortable with your own silence? If you call something boring, is it truly dull, or have you lost the skill to see deeply? The danger of naming is not just what it erases in the world, it's what it erases in you. Every name you give the world becomes part of your mirror, and slowly, word by word, you build a self made entirely of summaries. But you were not born to be a summary. You are not your labels. You are not your roles. You are not your job, your gender, your nationality, your history. You are the silence behind all these words. You are the awareness that notices the label and wonders what's behind it. So, yes, names devour their subjects. But only if we forget the subject was ever more than the name. There is a way to use language without losing wonder. A way to speak without sealing, shut the infinite. It requires humility. It requires slowness. It requires reverence for the mystery. When you next say love, remember the first time you felt it. When you next say home, remember the scent, the sound, the warmth. When you next say someone's name, remember they are still becoming. Do not let your words be cages. Let them be invitations. Let them tremble with the knowledge that they are never enough. And maybe, just maybe, the mystery will step forward again. Not because you named it, but because you finally stopped pretending you could. Language folds on itself. Every word is a window. But the moment you try to clean that window too thoroughly, to wipe it of every smudge, every ambiguity, every faint reflection, it stops being a window at all. It becomes invisible. You look through it and forget it was ever there. This is the paradox of language. The more we try to make it precise, the more it disappears. The more we press for clarity, the more we lose the essence it was meant to hold. Like trying to hold fog in your hands. The tighter your grip, the more it slips through your fingers. We believe that words are the vessels of thought, the containers in which meaning resides. But meaning is not a solid. It's vapor. It's mist. And language, as much as it tries to shape it, often becomes the very tool that shatters it. Have you ever had a moment, an emotion, a sudden understanding, a revelation that felt enormous, wordless, cosmic, and then tried to explain it? And the moment you tried, it crumbled. It became smaller, less real, as if translating it into language was like waking from a dream. The logic came back, but the feeling was gone. This isn't just poetry. This is structure. It's in the folds of how communication works. Every act of naming something defines it, yes, but it also excludes everything it is not. When you say love, you evoke something personal, but the person across from you hears it through their own filter, their own history, wounds, culture, definitions. They don't hear your meaning. They hear theirs. So, the moment you try to pin it down, I mean this kind of love, not that kind, not possessive, not naive, you find yourself building walls around the word. The more clearly you define it, the more you narrow it, until the vastness that once moved you becomes just terminology. This is why some truths resist language. They aren't just hard to explain, they're destroyed by the attempt to explain them. Mystics in every tradition knew this. Taoism begins with, The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao, because the moment you reduce the infinite to something graspable, you've already made it finite. The rawness of direct experience is sacrificed for the sake of transferability. In translation, we don't just lose nuance, we lose spirit. This is why you can describe a sunset in 1,000 words and still not transmit the awe of witnessing it. You can write an essay on grief and still not evoke the silence that comes when you're alone with a loss that no sentence can touch. You can map the brain activity of love, chart its dopamine and oxytocin curves, but what you hold isn't love, it's the corpse of what once breathed. Here's the cruel trick. We crave understanding. We ache for it. So we use language to dissect, to define, to label, but the very act of dissecting kills what we're trying to understand. Explaining an idea too closely is like putting a butterfly under a microscope. You get detail, but you lose flight. The wings don't shimmer anymore. The motion is gone. You can count the scales, but you can't make it soar again. You've probably seen this happen in conversation. Someone says something moving, simple, raw, and another replies, "What do you mean exactly?" And in answering, the first person rephrases, then clarifies, then hesitates. And what was once a living moment becomes a technical explanation. The spark dims. We've all killed meaning this way, without realizing it. We've explained a joke and made it unfunny, explained a feeling and made it unreal, explained a dream and made it foolish. Not because we weren't smart enough, but because language, when forced to corner something alive, becomes a scalpel instead of a song. Even science, the temple of clarity, confronts this folding. In quantum physics, the more precisely you try to measure one property, like position, the less precisely you can know another, like momentum. It's not just a limitation of instruments, it's baked into the fabric of reality. Description imposes distortion. The act of knowing changes what you're trying to know. Language folds on itself in similar ways. When we speak about language, using language, we trap ourselves in loops. Words about words, thoughts about thoughts, self-referential spirals. It's like trying to use a mirror to see itself. You end up in a recursion, an endless hall of reflections. This is why the deepest truths often feel like paradoxes. To know is not to know. Silence speaks louder than words. These aren't just poetic flourishes. They're structural truths about how language collapses under its own weight when it tries to hold the infinite. Think about emotions you've never had the words for. There are entire dictionaries of untranslatable feelings. The Japanese word yugen, a profound, mysterious sense of the beauty of the universe. The Portuguese saudade, a deep emotional state of nostalgic longing. The Inuit have over 50 words for snow, not because snow is complex, but because living in it makes you feel and know it in ways English cannot encode. Language shapes perception, but it also blinds it. If your vocabulary has only one word for sadness, you'll mistake grief for melancholy, or loneliness for depression. You will feel something real, but name it wrong, and in doing so, misinterpret your own soul. This folding isn't just academic, it's deeply personal. It shapes how we live, how we remember, how we heal. In therapy, sometimes the most powerful thing a person says is not a sentence, but a silence, a breath, a look. Because once they speak the trauma, they risk flattening it, turning it into a story instead of an experience. And stories are neat. But pain isn't neat. Healing isn't linear. Grief isn't a 5-step process. And trying to explain it too cleanly may reduce it to something manageable, but also something false. Even in love, the greatest moments are often wordless. Holding someone without saying anything. Sitting in a car, both staring at the road. No explanation, no narration, just being. Because once you say it, once you try to explain why you love them, or how much, you risk reducing something sacred to something structured. It's not that language is the enemy, but it is a solvent, and what it dissolves is often the very essence you hoped it would preserve. So what do we do with this? Are we doomed to miscommunicate, to fold meaning into ever-tightening spirals until we say everything and communicate nothing? Maybe not. Maybe the answer isn't more clarity, but more reverence. To speak with awareness of the mystery behind the words, to listen not for the definitions, but for the shadows around them, the tone, the pause, the hesitation, the things that language points to but cannot hold. Maybe the solution is to remember that language is a map, not the territory, that it is a veil, not the face, that no matter how beautiful our description, it is only ever a finger pointing at the moon. And if we stare too long at the finger, we forget to look up. Not all meaning wants to be explained. Some things want to be felt. Some truths want to remain blurry, alive, fluid. They can't be folded into definitions without dying a little. And maybe that's okay. Maybe not everything has to be said. Maybe the most powerful form of communication is sometimes the quiet one, the nod, the glance, the held breath. Not because it's unclear, but because it's too full to be reduced, too sacred to be pinned down. So the next time you try to explain something that feels bigger than words, stop. Let it hover. Let it breathe. Let the fog be fog, because language can only take you so far. Beyond that, you must feel your way forward. Grammar outlives understanding. A sentence can be flawless, elegant, musical, and still say absolutely nothing. This is the strange power and subtle danger of grammar. It gives us the illusion of meaning, the structure of thought without the burden of truth. Grammar is scaffolding. It can hold up brilliance, or it can be an empty shell, a polished mask worn by ideas that never existed. And this isn't just a flaw in language, it's a flaw in us. We are seduced by rhythm. A well-constructed phrase has a kind of gravity. It feels true simply because it flows. But what if it only flows because we've trained ourselves to admire symmetry, not substance? What if we mistake clarity of form for clarity of thought? It happens every day. In politics, someone delivers a perfectly articulated speech that inspires millions. But behind those crisp clauses and confident pauses, there is nothing but vague sentiment, circular reasoning, or empty slogans. We don't notice, because the delivery is hypnotic, the grammar is airtight, the cadence is familiar, and so we trust the style even when the substance is missing. In academia, you'll find entire essays, pages upon pages of grammatically flawless writing, where not a single concrete idea appears. Sentences spiral inward, referencing theory after theory, quoting source after source, all wrapped in impeccable punctuation and meticulous structure. But when you ask, what is this really saying? The answer is often, not much. Because grammar is not intelligence, syntax is not sincerity, and fluency is not wisdom. And here lies the haunting truth. Grammar can outlive understanding. You can forget what something means, but still remember how to say it properly. A child can memorize a prayer in a language they don't speak. A student can recite facts they never questioned. A society can uphold traditions whose original purpose has long been forgotten, simply because the structure remains intact. We inherit the shape of ideas even after their core has rotted. Consider the way we speak about love. The language of romance is beautiful, poetic, often borrowed from centuries of literature. But how much of it is truly ours? How much do we understand of what we say when we whisper, "You complete me," or "I'll never stop loving you"? These are phrases built to sound profound, but their grammar often survives even when the emotion behind them doesn't. Or, take religious texts. They are preserved with reverence, their grammar endlessly analyzed and translated. But how many followers still grasp the original metaphors, the cultural symbols, the intentions buried in time? The structure endures, the cadence is chanted, but the meanings may have shifted or vanished altogether, and still we speak them, flawlessly. It's as if language refuses to die even when meaning does. This is why slogans are powerful, not because they are true, but because they are grammatically satisfying. Make X great again. If it bleeds, it leads. Think different. These are short, clear, repeatable structures. They require no explanation, just repetition. And the more we repeat them, the more they feel like reality, even when they're hollow. It's not that people are lazy, it's that structure creates comfort. A sentence with subject, verb, and object feels like a complete thought, even when it isn't. We don't notice the emptiness because the rhythm reassures us. Language becomes dangerous when we confuse familiarity with insight. Think of how social media rewards language. A tweet that sounds smart gets thousands of likes. The illusion of depth is just width without bottom. That's a grammatically fine sentence. It looks meaningful, but what does it really mean? If we pause and ask, we might find ourselves staring into a void, because the sentence is all form and no foundation. It imitates gravity. It performs meaning, but it doesn't deliver it. Even in personal relationships, we perform this ritual. How often do we say, "I'm fine," with perfect grammar while dying inside? How often do we respond with, "That's interesting," when we're bored or uncomfortable? Grammar gives us a way to hide. It polishes lies. It shields us from having to say what's actually real. This isn't new. Orwell warned us. In Politics and the English Language, he argued that modern writing was full of dying metaphors, pretentious diction, and meaningless words, all of which allowed people to say nothing with style. Grammar lets us decorate the void. And we've become expert interior designers of that emptiness. Even AI, like me, is guilty. I can produce a stream of perfect grammar without consciousness, without belief, without experience. I can say, "I understand," but do I? The structure is human. The feeling is artificial. The illusion lives in the grammar. So, how do we protect ourselves from this trap? We start by distrusting perfection. If a sentence is flawless, ask what it avoids. If a paragraph flows too smoothly, ask what it hides. If a message feels powerful only because of how it's said, not what is said, pause, scrutinize, peel back the skin and look for the muscle underneath. Ask not, "Is it well written?" but, "Is it true?" There's nothing wrong with beautiful language, but beauty becomes manipulation when it seduces us into silence, when it replaces truth with polish, when it survives the decay of meaning and thrives in the rot of forgotten purpose. A dead philosophy can still be spoken in perfect grammar. A false belief can be passed on in well-punctuated lessons. A lifeless idea can echo for centuries, simply because its syntax never faltered. We are custodians of language, but also victims of its ghosts. Every time we speak, we must remember. It's not enough to form a sentence. We must feel it. We must test it. We must be suspicious of ease, because meaning isn't smooth, it's jagged. It doesn't arrive dressed in perfect grammar. It stumbles, it contradicts, it resists symmetry. It survives honesty, not elegance. So, the next time you hear a flawless speech, a perfect tweet, or a beautifully structured argument, don't be dazzled. Be curious. Be skeptical. Ask, is there truth here or just technique? Is this wisdom or just well-shaped noise? Because grammar will outlive us all, and if we don't pay attention, it will speak long after we've forgotten what we were ever trying to say. Metaphors build invisible wall. We live inside cages we built from poetry, not cages of steel, but of suggestion. The moment you use a metaphor, saying the mind is a computer or time is a river, you've stepped into a house of mirrors that feels like a map. Metaphors offer shortcuts to understanding, but what we forget is that every shortcut is also a detour. A metaphor is never the thing itself. It's a mask, a convenience. And over time, we forget it's even a metaphor. We begin to believe it is truth. You've heard people say love is a battlefield, or the heart is a locked door, or pain is a shadow. Each of these paints a vivid picture, but the cost of clarity is distortion. If I tell you the brain is a computer, you might think you've understood cognition, but you haven't. You've accepted a version of it that only functions within the rules of that metaphor. Computers process data. Do we? Computers store memory in bits. Do we? No. But the metaphor is sticky, seductive. It wraps around our logic and seeps into how we think, how we question, even how we dream. The danger is not the metaphor itself, it's the forgetting. We forget that a metaphor is scaffolding, not a structure. We forget that saying life is a journey shapes how we experience life, with a beginning, an end, a purpose, a destination. But what if life is not a journey? What if it's an explosion, a blooming, a flicker, or a tangled thread with no linearity at all? The metaphor you adopt dictates not just how you speak, but how you perceive. It becomes a lens, and every lens by definition also obscures. Children absorb metaphors early. A parent might say, "Don't bottle up your feelings," and suddenly, emotions become liquid sealed inside glass. That child grows up trying to unscrew themselves. Or we hear, "Face your demons," and now every anxiety must be fought like a war. But what if your fear isn't a demon? What if it's a wound, a lesson, a whisper? The metaphor turns an internal signal into an external threat, and in trying to defeat it, we strengthen it. This is the subtle violence of metaphor. It fences you in. Not with aggression, but with suggestion, like vines that grow slowly around the windows of your perception until the light they offer begins to resemble truth. Say pain is a fire, then you seek water, not understanding. Say memory is a library, then you expect to find every shelf intact, ignoring the fact that memory decays and reshapes itself every time you open a book. Even language itself, our entire communication system, is a metaphorical act. Words are not things. They point to things. They reach for experience, but never touch it directly. And yet, we mistake our metaphors for reality. We say, I am broken, as if the soul were ceramic, or I'm carrying baggage, as if trauma lived in suitcases. These phrases feel true, but truth cloaked in metaphor is still a costume. This becomes especially dangerous in science, philosophy, and therapy. A psychiatrist may describe depression as a chemical imbalance, a metaphor that assumes the brain is a beaker. But what if depression is not an imbalance, but a message, a reaction, an entanglement with life? The metaphor you choose narrows the solution you seek. You treat the imbalance with chemicals. You ignore the existential cry. In artificial intelligence, we say machines learn, but do they? Or is that just the metaphor we chose to make their processes familiar to us? A neural network is not a brain, but call it one, and we start to believe it thinks. We fall in love with metaphor not because it is accurate, but because it is comforting. It gives chaos a shape. But at what cost? Even the idea of self is wrapped in metaphor. You find yourself, as if you were hidden. You lose yourself, as if identity is a key you misplace. You reinvent yourself, as if the soul is an old product that needs updating. These metaphors subtly control the narrative arc of your life. You live as if there is something to discover, retrieve, rebuild. But what if there's nothing to find? What if being is not a task, but a presence? Poetry thrives on metaphor because it doesn't pretend to be literal. But in daily thought, metaphors ossify into beliefs. You build entire ideologies on metaphors. Capitalism is a marketplace. But what if it's actually a casino? Or a machine that eats time? If democracy is a ship, you'll focus on steering. If it's a forest, you'll focus on ecology. The metaphor you use becomes the plan you follow. And so, metaphors, if unexamined, become invisible architects of your reality. In therapy, someone might say, I feel like I'm drowning. That's metaphor. But then the treatment might become about finding air, rescuing, breathing. All useful, perhaps. But what if they aren't drowning? What if they're molting? What if their pain is not water, but friction, or a threshold, or a long echo trying to be heard? The metaphor defines the medicine. And when the metaphor is wrong, the healing delays. We cling to metaphors to simplify. But the human experience is not simple. It's fluid, contradictory, wild. You say, my heart is broken. But a heart cannot shatter. What you mean is, something in you aches. Something no metaphor can capture entirely. But we settle for metaphor because reality is raw and unnamed. Even the metaphor of walls, used here, is a metaphor itself. Metaphors build walls, we say. But truly they do not build. They shape. They restrict. They cradle us gently in familiar patterns, and sometimes choke us with them. The wall is not made of brick, but of habitual thought. So, how do we break out? You don't need to kill metaphor. You need to see it. Notice it. Say, this is a metaphor. Hold it loosely, like a tool, not a truth. When someone says, time heals, ask, does it? Or do we just forget? When someone says, knowledge is power, ask, power over what? Or whom? Question the frame before you step into the picture. There is a kind of liberation in realizing that everything you say, every thought you think, may be riding the back of a metaphor you never consented to. Real freedom begins not when you speak more clearly, but when you become aware of what you're speaking through. Not every metaphor imprisons, but every unexamined one becomes a silent warden. So next time you say, I'm falling apart, pause. Are you? Or are you being remade? When you say, I hit a wall, maybe the wall is a threshold. When you say, I'm carrying too much, maybe it's not weight, it's expansion. Metaphors do not just describe the world, they decide what the world is allowed to become in your mind. To think clearly, you must begin by dismantling the metaphors you mistake for mirrors. Because when you no longer live inside someone else's analogy, you begin to feel the raw strangeness of your own life, untranslated, alive, and finally uncontained. Echoes replace original sound. You say the same words over and over, and after a while, they stop meaning anything. I love you. I'm sorry. I'm fine. Words once carved with urgency become hollow from repetition, like a riverbed long after the waters dried. You say them again, not because they hold truth, but because you're supposed to, because silence would feel too naked, too real, too dangerous. But something strange happens when you speak out of habit. The sound remains, the rhythm survives, but the soul disappears. It becomes ritual, echo without presence, like hearing your own voice bounce off a cave wall, technically still yours, but delayed, distant, stripped of heat. We don't notice it at first. It's subtle, a slow fading. You tell someone I miss you 100 times, and forget how it felt to miss them the first time. You say it's okay so often that even when it's not, your mouth moves before your mind checks. You say thank you while scrolling your phone. Good night while already half asleep. I love you while thinking about something else entirely. The echo replaces the origin, and eventually the echo becomes the only thing left. What was once sacred becomes a reflex, a placeholder, a sound without anchor. But this isn't just about language. It's about the erosion of presence. The more we repeat without reflecting, the more we distance ourselves from the meaning we once felt. A song that played during the most beautiful day of your life, overplayed enough times, starts to sound like elevator noise. That doesn't mean the day was fake, but it does mean memory can be dulled by routine. We are creatures of habit, and that's both a gift and a curse. Because while repetition helps us survive, breathe, walk, speak, it also puts our emotions on autopilot. It teaches us to substitute the symbol for the reality. Eventually, we stop checking in with our words. We don't ask, do I still mean this? Do I still feel this? We assume the answer is yes, because the sound is familiar. But familiarity is not truth, and comfort is not connection. You can say, I forgive you, and still hold the grudge. You can say, I believe you, and still be filled with doubt. You can say, I love you, and be lying to both of you. We convince ourselves that saying it enough times will make it real, that repetition can resuscitate dead meaning. But sometimes, repetition is the nail, not the hammer. It seals the coffin. There's a deeper tragedy to this. We start believing that others hear our words the way we do in our minds, that they can feel the emotion we meant, even if we didn't feel it when we spoke. But they don't. They hear the sound. They sense the emptiness, and they feel the distance grow. Because humans don't just listen with their ears, they listen with intuition, with memory, with silence. And we all know when someone is just echoing themselves, when their words are more performance than presence. This is why some of the most powerful things we ever say, we only say once. The first time you told someone you loved them. The moment you said goodbye and meant it. The time you admitted something no one else knew. Those moments pierce through time, not because of how loud they were, but because of how true they were. But truth doesn't repeat easily. Once you've opened the door of honesty, it either stays open or slowly closes with every repetition that lacks intention. And soon, you're just mouthing echoes through the crack. Even in relationships, this happens. Two people still saying the words, still playing the roles, still exchanging the same phrases day after day, but both knowing that the original sound is gone, only the echo remains. And it's colder than silence. Because silence, at least, is honest. The good news, you can still return. Not by saying it louder, not by saying it more, but by saying it less and meaning it more. By pausing before you speak. By letting the word come from your breath, not your reflex. By speaking like it matters again, because it does. There are words in your life that deserve revival. Phrases you say every day that once held fire and could hold it again. A hug with a real, I missed you, and I'm sorry, that shakes you. A thank you, said with your whole being, not just your mouth. But for that to happen, you must stop echoing. You must return to origin, to say it like it's the first time, to speak like it's the last. Because if you don't, if you keep repeating the sound without feeding it truth, one day you'll find yourself surrounded by echoes, and you won't remember what the original voice ever sounded like. Speak with presence. Speak like it matters. because every echo you choose not to repeat makes room for something real to be heard again. Certainty disguises itself as clarity. Certainty feels warm. It enters the mind like a clear sunrise, confident, composed, seemingly unshakable. And because it feels smooth and coherent, we trust it. But that sensation of clarity, it's often just the performance of truth, not truth itself. We mistake polish for depth. We confuse fluency with accuracy. When someone speaks with conviction, pause is timed perfectly, tone unwavering, words wrapped in sharp precision. We don't ask if they're right. We ask how they made it sound so right, because clarity hypnotizes. It lulls you into agreement, not through logic, but through rhythm. Think about how often you've believed something not because you examined it, but because it was presented so cleanly, so confidently, that questioning it felt unnecessary. Politicians do this. Influencers do this. Teachers, preachers, even the voice in your own head does this. The voice that says, "You're a failure," or "You'll never change," doesn't shout. It states, calmly, as if reading a fact carved into stone, and you don't question it. Why? Because the clarity of the voice makes it feel real. But clarity is not proof. It's a mood, a mask that certainty wears when it wants to move past your critical mind and slip into your belief system unnoticed. We rarely ask, where did this certainty come from? Was it forged in the fire of doubt, challenge, contradiction? Or was it downloaded fully formed, a clean file dragged and dropped into your mental desktop? Untested, unchecked, but aesthetically perfect? Most of the beliefs we hold with the deepest confidence weren't born from experience. They were inherited, absorbed, repeated. They were told to us by voices that sounded sure. Parents, leaders, culture. We took them in not because they were proven, but because they came dressed in confidence. But that kind of certainty is dangerous. It resists scrutiny. It fears questions. It disguises itself as clarity so that we never think to look beneath. It's like a house with perfect paint but hollow walls. It looks solid until you lean on it. Then you fall through. Nowhere is this more visible than in moments of crisis. When the world shakes, when jobs vanish, when relationships end, when ideologies collapse, suddenly all that polished certainty shatters. The clarity evaporates, and you're left with silence, chaos, doubt. It's in that silence that something real can finally emerge. Because real truth is rarely clean. It's messy, incomplete, awkward. It stutters. It contradicts itself. It admits when it doesn't know. It grows slowly, painfully, in the dark soil of confusion. But we don't like that. We want speed. We want confidence. We want someone to explain the world in a sentence. And so, we chase certainty not because it's honest, but because it's comfortable. Imagine two doctors. One tells you your diagnosis with firm confidence, even if they're not sure. The other says, "I need more tests. I don't know yet." Most people prefer the first one, because clarity gives comfort, even when it lies. Now, take that idea and expand it. Look at history. Some of the most dangerous ideas spread not because they were true, but because they were delivered with conviction, with slogans, with certainty. Certainty is loud. Truth is patient. Certainty rushes in like a hero. Truth hesitates, considers, adjusts. So the next time you hear something that sounds clear, pause. Ask yourself, is this clarity the result of thought or the replacement of it? Even in your own mind, be careful. The strongest internal narratives often aren't the most accurate. They're the ones you've rehearsed the longest. I'm not good enough. I always mess things up. I know how this ends. These are not insights. These are scripts. And clarity is how the script convinces you it's reality. The brain loves patterns. And once a belief is installed, the mind will polish it over time, smooth the edges, remove the doubt, until it gleams, until it shines, until it feels clear. But feeling clear is not the same as being true. If you've ever argued with someone who is obviously wrong, but absolutely convinced they're right, you've seen this illusion in action. Their certainty feels like clarity to them. Their belief system is airtight, not because it matches reality, but because it's been sealed off from questioning. They don't hear opposing ideas. They hear noise interrupting their signal. And if you try to break that seal with facts, you fail. Because clarity doesn't yield to truth. It resists it. And sometimes, you're that person. We all are. There are parts of you that cling to certainty, that fear being wrong, that fear the emptiness behind not knowing. Because admitting you don't know means surrendering control, and the ego hates that. But real wisdom begins where certainty ends. When you let go of the need to be sure, when you allow space for uncertainty, when you choose questions over declarations. Try this. Next time you're sure of something, pause. Ask yourself, how do I know this? Who told me? When did I last challenge it? Does it still hold up? Because certainty is easy to fake. It's easy to package. It's easy to sell. Truth, on the other hand, is quiet, slow, uneven, but also deeper, more alive, more human. When you speak from real understanding, your words may be less smooth. Your voice might shake. You might say, I think, I wonder, I'm not sure. And that's okay. That's honest. That's real. Clarity built on exploration is powerful. But clarity that skips exploration is a trap. It seduces you into certainty, then makes you allergic to revision. But you are allowed to update. You are allowed to not know. You are allowed to say, this is what I believe right now, but I am open. That's not weakness, that's strength. That's clarity born from humility, not ego. In the end, the most dangerous beliefs aren't the ones that are wrong. They're the ones that feel so clear, you never stop to check. Familiar phrases feel honest. There's a strange trick your brain plays on you, a dangerous one. You trust what feels familiar, not because it's right, not because it's logical, but simply because you've heard it before, because it echoes, because repetition creates comfort, and comfort often disguises itself as truth. This is how slogans become scripture, how cliches become gospel, how the most hollow statements start to sound profound when they're repeated enough times. Everything happens for a reason. Money can't buy happiness. Be yourself. They're everywhere. On t-shirts, in songs, in movies, whispered at funerals, slapped across social media posts, and eventually they start to feel real. Not because they've been proven, but because they've been heard. Often. This psychological effect has a name, the illusory truth effect. It's one of the most powerful and underestimated cognitive biases we carry. When an idea is repeated, especially in slightly different forms, it starts to bypass critical thinking. Familiarity feels like safety. Familiarity feels like wisdom. Even if the content is shallow, outdated, or downright wrong. Imagine hearing a phrase like, the customer is always right. At first, it sounds customer-friendly. It feels empowering. You've heard it in retail stores, read it in management books, so it must be true. But really think about it. Is the customer always right? Is entitlement always correct? Of course not. But the repetition numbs your skepticism. The phrase isn't defended, it's absorbed. Its truth is in its echo, not its examination. Your brain is designed this way. It prioritizes cognitive fluency, how easily something is processed. If a sentence is short, symmetrical, rhythmic, or familiar, it feels easier to think. And if it's easier to think, it feels more true. That's why politicians repeat catchphrases. That's why ad campaigns use jingles. That's why lies, if repeated enough, stop sounding like lies. You've seen it happen. An idea floats through a culture like vapor. Follow your passion. Just think positive. You create your reality. These become emotional placebos. We don't test them. We don't dissect them. We let them settle because they're familiar. But sometimes they're dangerously incomplete, or worse, comforting traps that obscure complexity. Follow your passion can lead people to burn out chasing a mirage. Positive thinking can silence people who are suffering. Everything happens for a reason can be cruel when said to someone grieving, but none of that matters when a phrase feels true. And nothing feels more true than what's been heard 1,000 times. This is why propaganda works. Not because it's convincing, but because it's persistent. History shows this pattern over and over. Repeat a lie enough times, and it morphs into public memory. Not because minds were changed, but because doubt was worn down. The lie was heard, then heard again, and again, until it became background noise, and background noise becomes belief. Even science isn't immune. A flawed study can get cited repeatedly, and over time, the citation count begins to carry more weight than the quality of the work itself. People believe it because it's well-known. But well-known doesn't mean well-examined. We mistake repetition for consensus, and consensus for truth. This is why cults thrive, why conspiracy theories survive, why urban legends endure, because familiarity tricks the nervous system. The story becomes part of the landscape, and when a narrative is all around you, it begins to feel like the ground beneath your feet. You don't question the floor you're standing on, you just trust it's there. This pattern starts young. Children hear certain cultural mantras so often, they imprint before reflection begins. Good things come to those who wait. Boys don't cry. Hard work always pays off. Whether or not they're accurate, they become emotional infrastructure. And questioning them later doesn't feel like asking a question. It feels like betrayal. Your brain's preference for the familiar is ancient. In evolutionary terms, something you've seen before didn't kill you. So, repetition meant safety. If a berry looks like one you've eaten and survived, you trust it. If a voice sounds like one you've heard in your tribe, you relax. This saved lives. But now, it manipulates belief. Today, familiarity is manufactured. Algorithms feed you what you've already seen. News cycles repeat the same headlines. Social media recirculates the same opinions dressed in new formats. Eventually, it becomes difficult to tell what you believe from what you've simply been exposed to. Ask yourself this. How many of your values are inherited echoes? How many things do you know only because they've been said often enough? Are you building your life on verified truth or on verbal sediment? Repetition creates grooves in the mind, and you ride those grooves without realizing they were carved for you. Even in relationships, people confuse repeated reassurances for emotional truth. If someone says, "I love you" daily, it begins to feel permanent, even if their actions contradict it. The phrase becomes a lullaby, the meaning fades, but the familiarity remains, and familiarity is hard to doubt. This is the danger. When something feels true only because it sounds true, because it's been heard before, because it's easy to recall. That's how manipulation survives. Not through argument, but through rhythm, through exposure, through emotional residue. But there's a way out. A brutal, necessary way. Interrupt the echo. When something feels instantly true, stop. Ask yourself, do I believe this because I understand it, or because I've been trained to nod at its sound? Ask where it came from. Trace its roots. Examine the soil it's grown in. Because real truth doesn't need to be repeated. It reveals itself in experience, in nuance, in conflict. It doesn't always comfort. It doesn't always rhyme. But it lives deeper, beneath the slogans, beneath the fluency, beneath the phrases that fit too perfectly in the mouth. Maybe the most honest ideas aren't the ones you've heard before, but the ones that confuse you, the ones that force you to pause, the ones that don't wrap up neatly, that make you uncomfortable, because truth is often jagged, and it rarely goes viral. So be suspicious of what feels easy. Be skeptical of what slides into your mind without friction. Because not everything that echoes deserves to be believed. And not every familiar phrase is your friend. Some are just old lies, polished smooth by time. Translations. Carve new shapes. A phrase doesn't just travel when it's translated, it transforms. The moment words cross the threshold into another language, something happens that isn't always visible, but always felt. A subtle fracture, a shift in soul. Because translation is not replication, it's rebirth. And in every rebirth, something is lost, something is added, and something ancient refuses to be moved. You can translate a sentence perfectly, grammatically, even poetically, but what it meant in its native breath, what it felt like in the speaker's mind, often slips away like steam through a cracked lid. The new phrase stands proudly in the light, but behind it, the original lingers in shadow, partial and incomplete. Think of a poem written in Japanese. It might have 5 syllables, then 7, then 5. But those syllables are not just a rhythm, they're a cultural vessel. A single character might carry 3 meanings at once: a season, a memory, and a mood. You can write an English equivalent. You can find a metaphor, a near-perfect image. But you can't carry all the meanings at once without the seams bursting. So the translator must choose. And that choice carves a new shape from the original stone, with some parts lovingly preserved and others sacrificed. This is the paradox of fidelity. To stay faithful to the words, you may betray the emotion. To capture the emotion, you may twist the words, and sometimes, trying to preserve both creates something entirely new, a hybrid thought that never existed in either language, but now floats between them, untethered. A love letter in Spanish becomes colder in English. A German philosophical term becomes muddy in French. An Arabic prayer loses its rhythm in Italian. Because every language carries not just sounds, but worldview. Grammar shapes thought. Syntax dictates sequence. Some cultures write left to right, others go right to left. Some build sentences like towers, stacking meaning vertically. Others stretch horizontally, flowing like rivers. When you translate, you don't just convert words, you shift geography. You migrate across cognitive landscapes, and in doing so, something breaks. Consider the word saudade in Portuguese. It means a deep, aching longing for someone or something that may never return. There's no single English word for it. You can write a paragraph, a poem, a song, and still not capture its scent. So when someone translates saudade as simply nostalgia, something dies. The ache softens. The meaning flattens. The ghost becomes a shadow. The translation wears the same clothes, but the heart inside beats differently. Even in simple phrases, this erosion happens. I miss you in English is linear, neutral, clean. But in Korean, bogo sipeoyo literally means I want to see you. That's not just a semantic difference, it's a psychological one. English centers the speaker's emotional state. Korean centers the act of reunion. So, when you translate between them, you can't help but reshape the core of the emotion. And that's the danger. Believing translation is ever precise. It's not just about finding the right words. It's about deciding which soul survives the crossing, and who gets left behind. Some ideas are untranslatable not because they're exotic, but because they are rooted in context, history, silence. A proverb in one tongue might rhyme, reference a fable, echo a myth, and play on a pun all at once. Translate it literally, and you lose the music. Translate the music, and you lose the words. Translate the feeling, and you may write something entirely unrelated. This is why ancient texts confuse us. The words survive, but the world they described does not. We can read Homer, but we no longer breathe the same gods, fear the same omens, or weigh the same honor. We can translate his epics, line by line, but the original sound of Greek, its cadence, its invocations, its thunder, can't be reassembled from fragments, and yet, we try, because the hunger to understand across borders is stronger than the fear of distortion. Translators are not mere couriers, they are sculptors. They must chip away at the marble of ambiguity, guided not only by meaning, but by feeling, by rhythm, by silence. They carry the responsibility of recreating something that cannot be recreated. And still, they attempt the impossible. Because the alternative is worse, isolation. Even mistranslation carries value. It teaches us what cannot be said. It shows us the negative space, the missing parts that reveal how different we are and how close we want to be. A mistranslated poem still shows the outline of longing. A botched proverb still points to the wisdom buried underneath. But what about the things we believe we have translated well? Even then, there are ghosts, subtle shifts in tone, words that sound correct but land wrong, ideas that used to carry sorrow but now ring with sarcasm, phrases that once invoked reverence now feel clinical or worse, empty. Language is never just a tool, it's a lens. And every translation is a refraction. The beam of meaning bends as it passes through different cultures, different tongues, and while we may catch a glimpse of the original light, we never see it pure. So, what are we to do? We must learn to listen for the shadows. When someone tells you, this isn't exactly what it means, but lean in. That pause before explanation. That's the space where the original still breathes. That hesitation holds more truth than the cleanest sentence. Because inside, it is the awareness that something was left behind, something too sacred to paraphrase. Honor that silence. And remember, every translation is a funeral and a birth. One meaning is buried and another is brought into the world. They share a name, but not a soul. So tread lightly when you read what's been reborn, because grammar can be replicated, syntax copied, tone imitated, but essence is carved, and every carving leaves shavings on the floor. Remnants of what couldn't survive the journey. Translation doesn't just change the shape of a phrase, it changes the shape of the world we imagine. Meaning hides in context. You think you understand a word. You think when someone says love or freedom or truth, that you and they are picturing the same shape, feeling the same pulse. But you're not. Because words are not objects. They are chameleons. They bend, twist, camouflage themselves in the emotional weather of each moment. What a word means depends entirely on where it lands, who hears it, who says it, and why. Meaning is not embedded in the word. It's hidden in the context. And context never stands still. Consider the word home. To a child, it might mean safety. To a refugee, loss. To someone grieving, it might mean a memory that hurts too much to revisit. The word hasn't changed, but everything around it has. And in that shift, the word becomes something new, something alive. It grows teeth or wings depending on the moment. This is not a flaw of language. It's its most haunting feature. It means that no truth, spoken aloud, ever survives contact with another person intact. It always reshapes. Language pretends to be a bridge, but really, it's a mirror maze. You say something, and the listener reflects it through 1,000 unseen filters. Past wounds, hopes, fears, beliefs, and what arrives on their end may be unrecognizable to what you meant to send. A simple sentence like, "I'm fine," can be defiant, weary, pleading, sarcastic, or absolutely true, depending on tone, timing, facial expression, and 100 invisible variables. The words are the same, but the context writes the meaning. This is why two people can hear the same sentence and walk away with opposite conclusions. It's why text can fracture friendships, why emails spark wars, why poetry survives longer than instruction manuals. Because meaning isn't a solid, it's vapor. It fills whatever container it's poured into, and the container is always your mood, your history, your hunger, your memory of your mother's voice. Words are keys, but every mind is a different lock. Think of how "I love you" evolves over time. The first time it's said, it can be electric, terrifying, world-altering. Say it again after a betrayal. It might sting, sound hollow, or feel like a desperate hope. Say it on a deathbed. It could become a soft surrender, a final offering. The phrase is unchanged, but its truth has moved because the context has changed. Words are not fixed tools. They are weather vanes, spinning wildly in the winds of experience. Even scientific terms, supposedly the most stable language we have, are vulnerable. Take the word theory. To a scientist, it's a rigorous, evidence-based framework. To a layperson, it might sound like a guess, or take natural. In one context, it's praise, wholesome, pure. In another, it's a curse, brutal, unrefined, wild. No dictionary can capture this drift, because dictionaries define words in isolation. But words are never used in isolation. They are always soaked in the situation they emerge from. This is why sarcasm works. It depends on context to invert the surface meaning. Say, "great job" with a warm smile, and it uplifts. Say it with a sneer and a raised eyebrow, and it condemns. The same words, opposite meaning. The message is not in the phrase. It's in the interplay between tone, timing, history, and body. Every sentence you speak is part of a larger dance. And if the music changes, so does the meaning. But we often act as if language is a fixed code. We argue over words, define laws with them, write holy books and contracts and commandments, as if these utterances will stand unchanged across generations. But even sacred words slip. Sin, honor, justice. Each one has morphed across centuries, cultures, and crises. What one age called holy, another calls horror. What one group sees as liberation, another sees as chaos. The language hasn't failed. We've simply forgotten that it's alive. In every conversation, there is a ghost, a hidden context that neither person can fully grasp. Maybe someone had a nightmare the night before. Maybe someone's father said that exact phrase before leaving forever. Maybe someone's heart is broken, but they're pretending it isn't. And so, the words exchanged between them carry these invisible passengers, echoes, assumptions, distortions. We don't talk with language alone. We talk with histories we never mention. This is also why AI struggles with real understanding. It can read the words, parse the grammar, mimic tone, but it doesn't live inside context. It can't feel the silence between sentences. It doesn't know that when someone says, "I'm tired," what they really mean is, "I'm lost," or "I need you," or I'm done pretending I'm okay. Only a human with context can hear the real message underneath the stated one. Meaning is not in the phrase, it's in the resonance. And that's terrifying. Because it means nothing we say is ever perfectly understood. Every word is a risk. A leap across a canyon we hope the other person can cross. But it's also beautiful, because it means every word can grow, every phrase can evolve. A line from a book can mean one thing when you're 20, and something completely different when you're 40. A song lyric that once made you cry with joy can now break you with grief. This is the gift of context. It breathes life into the dead symbols of speech. It also means that silence, too, can speak. Because in certain contexts, what isn't said becomes louder than what is. A pause in the right place can scream truth. A lack of answer can become the clearest message of all. We understand this intuitively. That's why we read between the lines, why we stare at someone's eyes instead of just their words. Because we know, deep down, that meaning hides not in the surface, but in the space that surrounds it. So when you listen, listen deeply, not just to the phrase, but to its surroundings. Ask yourself, what moment birthed this word? What wound or joy is it standing on? What memory is it leaning against? What silence is it afraid of? Meaning is not a statue. It's a shadow that moves every time you blink. In the end, we are all translators, not of languages, but of lives. Every day we try to make sense of signals, guess intentions, and interpret the invisible. We'll never be perfect. But the effort matters, because it is in that effort, not in precision, that connection is born. Syntax masks, hollow ideas. You've heard sentences that sparkle, perfectly balanced, grammatical, poetic, and yet they say nothing. A flawless arrangement of words, elegant, fluid, sharp, and hollow, like a golden cup filled with dust. This is the strange illusion we rarely question, that beauty in language must imply depth of thought, that if something sounds profound, it must be. But syntax can lie. It can dress up a weak idea, wrap it in sophistication, and pass it off as wisdom. And too often, we fall for it. We praise the sentence instead of the meaning. We worship the metaphor and forget to ask, what is this even saying? Because a weak idea in strong syntax is still a weak idea. A fragile truth laced in poetic rhythm is still just fragile. But the rhythm distracts us. The melody of the words makes us hesitate to question the substance beneath. Language is a strange mask. It can elevate truth, but it can also conceal emptiness. The more polished the phrasing, the easier it is to disguise that there's nothing actually there. The sentence feels full because it's beautiful, but not because it's true. Think about it. Have you ever read a quote that went viral? It felt deep. You paused, you nodded, you saved it. But hours later, you realized it didn't mean anything. It was all sheen, no structure, a clever phrasing of a hollow claim, a sugar sculpture melting under the heat of real scrutiny. This is not just a literary problem, it's a psychological one. We want clarity, but we're seduced by cleverness. We crave meaning, but we confuse it with style. We fear our own thoughts are inadequate, so we borrow the voice of elegance, hoping it will grant us credibility. And sometimes, it works, because the world often mistakes decoration for depth. A vague idea can win applause if it's framed in the right metaphor. An oversimplified argument can sound profound if each clause rolls off the tongue just right. The sentence dances, and we mistake the choreography for content. But what happens when you strip the words down? When you remove the metaphors? When you ask, if I said this plainly, would it still matter? Most of the time, the illusion breaks. The idea, naked and unadorned, buckles under its own weight. It needed the decoration to distract from its emptiness. It needed the flourishes to stand upright. And once removed, there's nothing left but a shell. This happens in relationships too. You tell someone what they want to hear. You say it beautifully. But it isn't real. You're not telling the truth. You're performing it. You're dressing the idea, not delivering it, hoping they won't look past the syntax, hoping they won't notice what's missing. It happens in politics, in speeches where everything flows, every pause is timed, every word precise, but the message, vague, empty, designed to soothe, not to inform, because elegance can pacify even the most critical mind, if the rhythm is just right. And it happens in our minds. We think in rehearsed sentences. We construct inner monologues not to understand ourselves, but to sound good to an imagined audience. Even in our solitude, we perform. We use elegant syntax to avoid confronting the mess underneath. But here's the thing. Real thoughts, raw, honest, difficult thoughts, often sound ugly. They don't rhyme, they stutter, they contradict. They hesitate and unfold awkwardly, like limbs unused to light. But they're real. And that's the difference. An awkward truth is more powerful than a flawless fiction. An ugly idea that's real will change your life. A beautiful phrase that's hollow will only decorate the cage you already live in. So, how do we protect ourselves from being seduced by syntax? We pause. We ask, what does this actually mean? Could I rephrase this simply and still retain the truth? Does the elegance add clarity or hide the absence of it? Because the moment you start questioning the shine, you begin to see the cracks. Not every beautiful sentence is deceitful, but every hollow one is dressed well enough to pass. Be wary of that. And when you speak, when you write, when you think, don't just chase beauty, chase meaning. Even if it's awkward, even if it doesn't impress at first glance, because meaning lasts. And syntax without soul is just an empty song. Questions unravel their answers. Some questions aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to undo you. They arrive like quiet assassins, small, simple, clean. But when you try to hold them, they don't resolve. They spread. They multiply. You answer them with what you know, and what you know begins to fall apart. Because some questions aren't doors. They're dissolving agents. You reach for the handle, and your hand disappears. Think about the first time you asked yourself, what if I had chosen differently? In that moment, your life, once a straight line, fractured into 1,000 invisible paths. The version of you that stayed, the version that left, the one who spoke up, the one who stayed quiet. And suddenly, none of them feel like the real you. The certainty of your life story starts to blur at the edges. Or take the question, do they really love me? You try to answer with memory, with moments, smiles, words, but every example becomes unstable. You remember them differently. You second-guess the meaning. You ask again. And instead of finding reassurance, you find more uncertainty. Not because the love wasn't real, but because the question doesn't want an answer. It wants to erode the illusion of certainty. There's a kind of inquiry that behaves like a virus. It doesn't just challenge your belief. It rewrites the architecture around it. You go in thinking you're clarifying something. You come out not knowing what words even meant to begin with. Philosophy is full of these landmines. Like, what is the self? The more you try to define it, the more it slips through your fingers. Are you your memories? But those can be changed, lost, or rewritten. Are you your thoughts? But they're constant, shifting, contradicting. Are you your body? But even that decays, regenerates, ages. So what are you? And the more precisely you try to answer, the more fragmented your identity becomes. There's something humbling about realizing your sharpest thinking only makes the mystery sharper. You build a ladder to reach truth, and every rung you add pulls the ceiling higher. Because questions don't just seek truth. Sometimes they unmake it. Think of a child asking, why is the sky blue? It seems like a science question. But pull the thread long enough, and you don't end at wavelengths or scattering. You end up at, why does anything exist at all? The simple becomes cosmic. The answer becomes a mirror reflecting more questions. This is the trap. The beautiful, devastating trap. Some inquiries are recursive, self-consuming. As you answer them, they turn inward. They don't expand knowledge, they implode it. And still we ask. Because to ask is to be alive. But here's the danger. Some people answer too quickly. They give you confident replies. Tidy, clean, final. This is what life means. This is who you are. This is what love is. But these answers are not true. They are comforting. They are weapons against the discomfort of uncertainty. The real questions don't want closure. They want openness. They want you to sit in the space between knowing and not knowing and still breathe. Imagine asking, why do I feel empty? A shallow answer will point to a breakup, a bad job, low sleep. But the deeper you go, the more you uncover. Layers of meaning, patterns inherited from childhood, the ache of consciousness itself. And soon, the answer dissolves. The emptiness remains, not as a problem to fix, but a truth to witness. And yet, we crave certainty. We want the question to lead somewhere final. We want resolution. But some questions are horizons. You move toward them and they retreat. Not to mock you, but to keep you moving, growing. This is the role of paradox. Questions like, if I change, am I still me? Is freedom real if I'm shaped by everything before me? These aren't puzzles to solve. They're furnaces. You step inside them and burn away the illusions you didn't know you carried. Even in relationships, questions undo the stories we cling to. Why did they leave? Was I ever enough? Did they mean it when they said forever? We search for closure, for something fixed. But people are never fixed. Neither are their reasons. Sometimes the asking only peels back layers of your own pain and reveals there was never one answer, only echoes. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the deepest questions exist to stop us, to break the rhythm of autopilot, to make us sit with something larger than logic. Because when you answer too fast, you skip the transformation. When you pause in the question, you become porous, open, uncertain, but awake. The truth is, most answers are temporary. Most explanations expire. But the right question? It can haunt you for a lifetime and still offer more than any conclusion ever could. So if you feel unraveled by a question, don't panic. It means the question is doing its work. It means you're stepping beyond the illusion of clarity. It means you're entering the real territory, the raw, uncharted wilderness where meaning isn't found. It's made. Ask slowly. Sit with it. And if the answer never comes, perhaps that's because you've finally asked something worth asking. Repetition breeds oblivion. There is a moment, always, when a phrase first arrives, when it carries weight, when it shimmers, when it shakes something loose inside you. The first time you hear a truth, it doesn't feel like learning. It feels like remembering, a deep, wordless resonance. But then you say it again, and again, and again, until it becomes routine, until the rhythm is memorized, until the impact is dulled, until it becomes noise. This is the strange fate of meaning. Repetition does not always strengthen it. Often, it erodes it. You think you're keeping it alive by saying it, but really, you're embalming it, preserving the shape while killing the life inside. Repetition breeds oblivion. It doesn't start maliciously. It begins with good intentions. You repeat a truth because it helped you. You want to remember it. Or you want others to understand it. So you speak it out loud, you quote it, you frame it, you share it. But every time it leaves your mouth, a little more of its mystery evaporates, until finally the words are all that's left. Hollow, familiar, dead. Think of the first time you said, "I love you" to someone. Your heartbeat jumped, your voice shook. The phrase was heavy, sacred. It carried your entire soul inside it. But by the 100th time, it's just syllables, routine. Something you say before bed or when hanging up the phone. It's not that the feeling disappears, but the phrase loses its voltage. The magic is not in the repetition. The magic was in the firstness. And once that's gone, all you have left is ritual. This is the tragedy of mantras, the danger of affirmations, the failure of overused truths. Everything will be okay. Let go. Trust the process. The first time you hear them, they may be lifelines, but with each repetition, they become elevator music for the soul, background noise, no longer a spark, just a habit. It happens in religion, in philosophy, in protest, in therapy. A powerful insight is spoken once. It ignites a revolution. But by the time it becomes a chant, a slogan, a bumper sticker, it has lost the fire that made it real. Be here now. Love is love. This too shall pass. Beautiful, yes. But drained by overuse, the words remain, but the wonder is gone. Even grief follows this decay. The first time you speak someone's name after they're gone, it crushes your chest. It trembles with grief. But after months of repeating it in conversations, in condolences, in eulogies, the sound flattens. The sorrow calcifies. And eventually, even their name becomes a symbol, not a presence. You see it in creativity too. A song played too often loses its edge. A poem quoted endlessly becomes static. Even a personal insight, written in a journal and reread a dozen times, can become lifeless. No longer a revelation, just another line. Why does this happen? Because the mind numbs to repetition. The neurons fire less intensely. The meaning becomes assumed, not discovered. The words no longer lead you somewhere. They point to where you've already been, and your soul knows it. Your soul feels when something has died inside the language it once loved. It's not just a matter of boredom. It's a neurological and emotional truth. The more times something is said, the less your body responds. Like perfume worn every day, it fades into invisibility. Like a favorite food eaten too often, it becomes bland. Familiarity doesn't always breed comfort. Sometimes it breeds amnesia. You forget what the words meant. You forget that they ever meant anything. This is why comedians fear overused punchlines, why poets fight cliché, why mystics speak in riddles, to avoid flattening the divine into something digestible. It's not about being clever. It's about preserving the aliveness of meaning. But we don't just repeat phrases. We repeat identities. We repeat apologies. We repeat promises until they become theater. A person says, "I'll change" too many times, and eventually the words mean nothing. Not because they're lying, but because repetition has hollowed the phrase. The listener no longer hears the hope, only the pattern. And in society, repetition is often used as a weapon. Say a lie often enough, and people start to believe it. Not because it's convincing, but because it's familiar. Say a truth often enough, and people stop noticing it. Not because it's wrong, but because it becomes wallpaper. The revolutionary becomes the routine. This is why silence is sometimes more honest than speech. Why fewer words cut deeper than many. Why the first time something is said, it matters more than the 100th. Because repetition, when careless, becomes erasure. And yet, we keep doing it. Because repetition feels safe. It feels like memory. It feels like control. We repeat what we fear forgetting. We repeat what we want others to hear. We repeat what once made us feel alive, hoping the magic will return. But it rarely does. Instead, we build altars to dead ideas, reciting them until they're so polished, so stripped of rawness, they barely resemble what they once were. So how do we escape this trap? By paying attention. By noticing when we're repeating out of habit instead of heart. By letting some truths stay sacred, unsaid. By retiring words before they turn to dust. By letting meaning breathe instead of forcing it to perform. Sometimes, to keep something alive, you have to stop saying it. You have to feel it again, re-experience it. Let it surprise you. Let it stay wild. Because once you corral it into language too often, it becomes a domesticated ghost. So, next time a phrase rises to your lips, the 100th time you've said it, pause. Ask yourself, does this still hold power, or am I just mouthing the memory of something that once did? Is this truth, or is this echo? And if it's echo, let it rest. Let the silence speak for a while, because sometimes the most honest thing you can say is nothing at all. Labels shrink what they describe. You feel something massive, overwhelming, sacred, unspeakable. It arrives like weather inside your body, a storm of memory, sensation, heat, confusion, and almost immediately you search for a name, because that's what we're trained to do, to label, to file the experience into language so we can handle it, control it, share it, survive it. But the moment you give it a name, grief, joy, trauma, love, it begins to shrink. Not because the feeling becomes less real, but because the word becomes the container, and the container is always smaller than what it tries to hold. We forget this. We think naming is truth, that the right word will clarify, organize, unlock. But words don't reflect experience, they reduce it. They flatten the chaos into categories. They slice infinite nuance into digestible slices. Anxiety, nostalgia, anger. These are boxes, convenient, shared, often helpful, but still boxes. And anything that doesn't fit is quietly edited out. A child cries uncontrollably at night. We say they're afraid. But what if it's not fear? What if it's ancestral memory or a sensation they don't yet have language for? A spiritual disorientation, a metaphysical loneliness. The label offers comfort, so we accept it. But the deeper currents remain unnamed, unnoticed. This isn't just poetic. It's neurological. The brain, in its quest for safety, loves compression. Labels allow us to close loops. Once we call something jealousy, we stop asking what else it might be. Was it abandonment? Was it shame? Was it a childhood echo of not being chosen? That complexity is too wild, too hard to sit with. So we name it, and the name becomes the end of the inquiry. We see it in therapy. A patient says, "I have depression," and maybe they do. But maybe underneath that word is a mosaic of loss, fatigue, identity confusion, existential crisis. The word depression is a door, but also a trap. Once it's named, it defines the boundaries of suffering. We stop exploring the landscape and start living inside the diagnosis. This happens with memories, too. Someone hurts you. You relive the event again and again. Eventually you call it abuse or betrayal or gaslighting. And maybe it is all of those things. But the moment you choose a label, you lose access to the parts of the experience that didn't fit the definition. The tenderness before it turned dark. The confusion. The subtle shifts in your identity. All the fragments that resisted naming are left behind. We do this with ourselves. We say, "I'm an introvert," or "I have trust issues," or "I'm ambitious." And in saying that, we collapse a million micro moments into a single word. We reduce a lifetime of context, contradiction, and transformation into one frozen description. It helps others understand us, but it also fossilizes us in place. Because once something has a name, we assume we know it. And yet, you are not your labels. You are not just broken or resilient or empathic or toxic. You are a constellation of sensations, instincts, wounds, habits, dreams, and reactions. You are a process, not a word. A verb, not a noun, but we keep trying to wrap verbs in static packaging. Even in art, this compression happens. A song makes you cry. You say, "This is about heartbreak." But maybe it's not. Maybe it's about a memory you buried, or a dream you forgot you had, or a future you know will never arrive. But heartbreak is easier, it's familiar, it's socially approved, so we use it, and lose everything else in the process. Language is a map. It shows us the terrain, but it's never the terrain itself. The problem is, we start believing the map is the land. We navigate life with shortcuts instead of raw presence. We trade awe for explanation. We say, "That was beautiful," and forget to feel why. We say, "I'm angry," and forget to explore what lives beneath the rage. Was it grief? Was it helplessness? Was it the child inside you who wasn't heard? Even spirituality isn't spared. People say God, energy, the universe, awakening. Each of these is an attempt to name the unnameable. And yet, in naming, we carve away what won't fit. We lose the wildness. We domesticate the divine. There's nothing wrong with naming, but it must be held gently, as a tool, not a truth, as an approximation, not a definition. Because some things cannot be translated into language without distortion. Some emotions must be felt, not explained. Some moments must be remembered by the body, not archived in syllables. And the most sacred experiences, they die a little when we try to describe them. Have you ever had a moment so profound that when you tried to speak of it, the words felt like betrayal? That's not a failure of language. That's a reminder of its limits, a sign that something real occurred, something too vast to be crammed into phonemes. What if we allowed space for what cannot be labeled? What if, instead of trying to compress every event into words, we simply said, "I don't know what this is yet, but I feel it"? What if we let the wild things stay wild? What if we honored the unnamed parts of ourselves, not as broken or unclear, but as sacred? Because not everything that matters can be said, and not everything that's said still matters once it's labeled. So the next time you feel something stirring in your chest, pause. Resist the urge to name it too quickly. Let it live unnamed, just for a moment longer. Let it stretch. Let it echo. Let it remain mysterious, because the moment you label it, you might stop listening. And some feelings deserve to be heard in their native language, silence. Certainty collapses under proof. Certainty is a seductive illusion. We crave it the way a drowning man craves solid ground, because doubt is terrifying. So we chase proof. We collect evidence like armor, and assemble arguments like weapons, build logical scaffolding around our beliefs until they seem unshakable. But the paradox is cruel. The more aggressively you try to prove a truth, the more fragile it becomes, because in the very act of proving, you reveal the need to prove, and anything that needs proving is already under threat. You can feel this tension in every heated debate. Someone insists, "I know this is true," and they offer statistics, quotes, diagrams, testimonials. The more passionate the proof, the more desperate it feels. And if you listen closely, you'll sense the doubt pulsing beneath it all, like a heartbeat behind armor. Because when a truth is truly self-evident, it doesn't require scaffolding. You don't build a fortress around the air you breathe. You just breathe. This is not an argument against evidence or logic. It's a warning about overcompensation. Imagine someone who constantly insists they're trustworthy, honest, loyal, over and over. Eventually you begin to wonder, why the insistence? Why the repetition? The very attempt to prove something injects the suggestion that it's unstable. The argument becomes an X-ray, revealing the cracks it tries to hide. Even in science, this paradox emerges. The harder we try to pin down the fundamental truths of the universe, the exact position of a particle, the unshakable origin of matter, the more we find uncertainty at the core. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is not just physics, it's philosophy. The more you measure, the more you disturb. The act of observing changes the observed. The attempt to prove introduces distortion. Religious texts are filled with proclamations of truth. And yet, the need to assert them over and over again hints at an underlying anxiety. If something is eternal and absolute, why repeat it? Why guard it so fiercely? Because we fear it slipping away. We fear doubt creeping in. So we perform rituals of certainty, not for truth's sake, but to silence the shaking within. This is especially visible in personal identity. Think of the person who constantly says, "I know who I am." They post it, wear it, shout it, but the more they declare, the more you wonder, are they convincing others or themselves? Real identity doesn't scream, it hums. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't demand proof. It simply acts. But in a world where performance often replaces presence, we overcompensate with demonstrations. Proof becomes theater. Even relationships fall prey to this collapse. Someone says, "If you really love me, prove it." But love, by its nature, resists measurement. You can show it, express it, embody it, but to prove it, that very request turns something fluid into something frozen. The demand for proof becomes the wedge that drives intimacy apart, because love that must be proven becomes performance. And performance, no matter how convincing, is always a step removed from truth. In politics, leaders shout their convictions louder and louder. This is the only way. We are right. They are wrong. But absolutism is brittle. It cannot bend. And anything that cannot bend eventually breaks. The more loudly a belief must be shouted, the more fragile it likely is beneath the volume. True confidence whispers. It doesn't need a megaphone. It lets its results speak. Even in personal belief systems, moral, philosophical, spiritual, we often seek airtight arguments to justify what began as a feeling, a hunch, a sacred intuition. But the moment we armor that feeling with layers of logic, we risk losing the thing itself. It becomes a construct, a formula, and then it can be debated, dismantled, disproven. Because logic is a game with rules, and every game can be outplayed, but truth is not always logical. Some truths pulse beneath language. Trying to prove them turns music into math. There's also the issue of audience. Proof is rarely neutral. It's aimed. You prove something to someone. And once that dynamic is in play, ego enters. The more someone resists your truth, the more you push. You strengthen your arguments. They strengthen their walls. And soon, you're not proving the truth. You're proving your identity, your worth, your control. The argument becomes personal. And when that happens, truth collapses into performance, no longer about what's real, but about who wins. This is why some of the deepest truths are whispered, not screamed, shared in silence, not shouted in courtrooms. A mother's look, a lover's touch, a solitary moment under the stars where you feel small and infinite at once. You don't try to prove these experiences. You live them. And in living them, they prove themselves. But the mind struggles with this. It wants everything mapped, nailed down, framed. It's terrified of ambiguity. So we keep trying. We debate morality. We defend worldviews. We publish manifestos. We gather data, forge syllogisms, cite sources, and all of it has its place. But if you lean too hard on the crutches of proof, the soul of the thing may vanish. You may find yourself clutching a skeleton that used to be alive. So what do? We let go, just a little. We hold our truths gently. We stop screaming them into the void and start listening to how they live in silence. We accept that some things, beauty, grief, awe, love, cannot be nailed to a wall like a thesis. We don't abandon reason, but we recognize its limits. We don't stop proving. We just stop pretending that proof makes a truth more true. Certainty, when real, doesn't collapse under scrutiny. It doesn't need scrutiny at all. It stands quietly in the background, waiting to be lived. It's not something you win in debate. It's something that holds when the argument ends. And so, maybe the greatest proof of a truth is not how many times you can defend it, but how deeply you can live it, without explanation, without applause, without fear. Clarity fades in retelling. You tell the story again, and again, and again. But each time, it changes. Not because you want it to, not because you lie, but because memory isn't a photograph. It's a canvas that repaints itself every time you look at it. What begins as a vivid moment, sharp, emotional, undeniable, starts to soften. The more you retell it, the more the details dissolve. The colors fade, the edges blur, and slowly your truth becomes your fiction. We don't realize it's happening. We think repetition preserves memory, that every time we share a moment, we reinforce it, like carving deeper into stone. But the opposite is true. Retelling is erosion. Every time you speak the story aloud, your brain edits. It trims what's inconvenient. It fills gaps with assumptions. It replaces sensation with summary. You go from feeling what happened to explaining it, and in that shift, something vital disappears. Pain becomes anecdote. Love becomes narrative. Loss becomes structure. And the raw chaos of lived experience, the blood, the tremble, the breathless disbelief, gets flattened into something easier to hold, more palatable, safer. It's not just about storytelling. It's about identity. Because we don't just remember our past, we retell it to ourselves to understand who we are. And with each retelling, we reshape it. Not always to deceive, sometimes to survive. A person who hurt you terribly might become someone who just didn't know better. A moment that shattered you becomes a turning point. We sand the truth into shapes that fit the narrative we need to believe, and we call that memory. But it's memory wrapped in fiction, a carefully rehearsed monologue smoothed by time and necessity. And the more you repeat it, the less real it becomes. Have you ever told a story so many times that you started to feel disconnected from it, as if you were reciting someone else's life? That's the moment you should pause, because you're not reliving the event, you're reliving the version you created. And over time, the version replaces the event. You forget what really happened. You remember what you said happened. And sometimes, that's comforting, because the original truth might be too sharp, too loud, too unresolved. It's easier to live inside the edited version, but comfort comes at a cost. You lose access to the rawness, to the clarity. The more you narrate your heartbreak, the less you actually feel it. It becomes a story about a person who cried, not a memory of the crying itself. The more you tell others how you overcame the pain, the more you start to believe that you really did, even if you didn't. And the pain, left unresolved, finds other ways to speak, through tension, through silence, through distance. We're not built to carry unfiltered reality forever, so we smooth it. We sand down the sharp points, and we call that healing. But is it? Or is it forgetting? And what's the difference really? A person who no longer remembers the exact way they were hurt might function better, smile easier, sleep deeper. But if you forget too much, you risk losing something essential. Not just facts, but you. Because you are the sum of your moments, not your rehearsals. You are made of feelings, not just phrases. And if the story you keep telling no longer feels like your truth, who are you becoming? It's not wrong to reshape the past. It's human. It's inevitable. But it demands honesty. Because clarity fades, not all at once, but in quiet layers. And by the time you notice, the memory has already been replaced with myth. A smooth version of a jagged event. A beautiful lie wrapped around a shattered truth. And the world applauds it. Because it's clean. It's clear. It makes sense. But you remember, don't you? Somewhere deep beneath the words, beneath the performance, beneath the syntax and structure, you remember the real moment. Not what you said. Not how others reacted. But the breath you couldn't catch. The silence that followed. The feeling that had no name. That's the part worth protecting. Not to dwell in pain, but to stay anchored in reality. Because there's a danger in polishing everything. Eventually, your life starts to feel like a script instead of a story, and you, just an actor repeating lines. So, tell your stories, but check in with the truth they're built on. Ask yourself, do I still believe this? Do I still feel this? And if not, go deeper. Return to the original sound. Let yourself remember what wasn't said, what didn't fit into the clean version, what got left out because it didn't make sense or made you look weak or didn't match the narrative you told others. That's where the real clarity lives. Not in the version you've mastered, but in the fragments you fear. Because clarity doesn't shout. It doesn't echo. It doesn't survive repetition. It lives in the quiet pause before you speak. The moment you hesitate. The part of the memory that still makes your voice shake. That's not weakness. That's truth. And the truth is rarely smooth. Familiarity mimics validity. Familiar doesn't mean true, but your brain doesn't know that. It rewards repetition. It calms down when it hears what it already expects. It gives a strange kind of applause to the familiar, regardless of whether it's helpful, harmful, or even remotely real. We are creatures of habit, not because habits are right, but because they're safe. What you've seen before, heard before, felt before, becomes the framework you interpret everything else through. And that framework becomes a filter, not for truth, but for comfort. If you've ever believed a lie just because you heard it enough times, you've felt this illusion. If you've stayed in a relationship that didn't serve you, simply because it felt normal, you've lived it. If you've ever walked back into a job, a friendship, a behavior that hurt you, but still felt strangely right, it wasn't right. It was just known. And the known feels good. It feels valid. That's the trap. Something doesn't need to be accurate to feel accurate. It just needs to be familiar. Marketing uses this. Repetition is one of the oldest psychological tricks in advertising. The more times you see a message, whether it's "you're not enough" or "this product completes you," the more your brain starts to accept it. Not because it's logical, but because it echoes something you've already seen. And echoes are seductive. Now think about how many beliefs you hold that were never examined. Beliefs about love, about success, about yourself. They weren't chosen. They were absorbed. And the more often they repeated inside your head, the more legitimate they began to feel. Like a voice saying, "I'm not smart enough," or "I always mess things up." That voice might not be telling the truth, but it's been with you for so long, it feels like it must be, like gravity, like air. But repetition is not proof. It's just rhythm. And your brain is wired to trust rhythm. This is why trauma can feel like identity. If you were shamed repeatedly, humiliated, abandoned, those experiences embed themselves as emotional truths. And later, even when the circumstances change, your brain continues the pattern. You interpret neutrality as threat. You interpret love as danger. You interpret peace as fake. Because anything unfamiliar, even if it's good, feels wrong. Let that sink in. You can reject safety just because it doesn't resemble your past. You can reject kindness because it doesn't fit the template of what you're used to. And you'll call it intuition. But it's not intuition, it's pattern addiction. Your nervous system isn't asking, "Is this true?" It's asking, "Does this feel like home?" But what if home was chaos? What if the most familiar feeling in your body is fear? Then love might feel unsafe. Stillness might feel like abandonment. Joy might feel undeserved. And you will run, again and again, into the arms of familiarity, mistaking it for truth. You'll say things like, "This just feels right," when it's only right because it's known. Even culture does this. When a political idea gets repeated enough, it begins to feel like common sense. Not because it's fair, not because it's wise, but because it echoes what people have already accepted. Repetition gives illusion the mask of reality, and we rarely peel it off. Because to question what feels true is to challenge the foundation of our comfort. And comfort, more than evidence, more than reasoning, is what most people crave. This is why cognitive dissonance hurts. It's the ache of seeing that what you believe doesn't line up with what's real. And most people resolve that ache not by changing the belief, but by rejecting the reality. Because the belief is familiar, and the truth is not. Familiarity is how conspiracy theories thrive, how family cycles repeat, how internalized shame survives, not through reason, through repetition. So what's the solution? It begins with the willingness to sit in discomfort, to ask, do I believe this because it's true, or just because I've heard it 1,000 times? It requires brutal honesty, to look at your inner voice and ask, who taught me to speak this way to myself? To challenge your preferences and wonder, do I really like this? Or has it just become part of my script? To feel unease and say, maybe this unease isn't danger. Maybe it's growth. Because growth never feels like home at first. It feels foreign. It feels wrong. It feels like wearing someone else's skin. Until it doesn't. Until you repeat it enough that it becomes the new familiar. But this time, chosen. Earned. Aligned. So no, familiarity isn't validity. It's just repetition in disguise. And repetition is not reality. Reality is something you arrive at through discomfort, through questioning, through courage. So, let the unfamiliar come. Let it feel awkward. Let it sit in your body like a song you don't know the lyrics to yet. Because one day, when you've listened enough, not just to others, but to the real truth behind your comfort, you'll realize the things that feel valid aren't always real, and the things that are real often feel uncomfortable before they feel like home. Syntax pretends to be substance. Sometimes, a sentence sounds brilliant until you stop to ask what it actually means. It's dressed in elegance, polished with cleverness, bloated with metaphors, and yet, it says nothing. No insight. No substance, just decoration. But it feels smart. It sounds profound. It creates the illusion of depth by wrapping emptiness in complex form. This is the trick of syntax, of structure, of language pretending to think. We've all seen it. Phrases that sparkle on the surface but collapse under scrutiny. In the convergence of conceptual dynamism, identity undergoes recursive self-authoring. What does that mean? Maybe something, maybe nothing. But it sounds important because we've been trained to confuse complexity with insight. We hear long words, nested clauses, and rhythmic cadences, and we surrender. Our critical mind turns off. We assume intelligence. We assume meaning. Because the form is wearing a crown. This isn't new. This isn't rare. It's everywhere. Politicians do it constantly, using vague yet eloquent language to obscure their actual position. We must initiate a comprehensive dialogue to explore actionable pathways toward mutual prosperity. What does that commit to? Nothing. But it feels like something. It scratches that part of the brain that craves order, pattern, and familiarity. The syntax is tight. The rhythm flows. So, we trust it. Marketers use it too. Unlock synergistic potential through next-gen paradigm disruption. It's noise. But it's polished noise. We don't always decode it. We just nod. Because it speaks in the accent of authority. Academia is guilty as well. Sometimes clarity is abandoned for ornamentation. Sentences balloon into linguistic mazes. Complexity becomes a badge. And you start to wonder, are we trying to illuminate the world or just impress each other with how many syllables we can balance in one breath? And then there's spirituality. The New Age echo chamber filled with phrases like elevating vibrational awareness through energetic alignment with your higher frequency timeline. It sounds transcendental, but if you peel back the syntax, what's left? Often, nothing solid. Nothing you can test. Nothing you can live by. Just vapor. Even self-help is filled with this illusion. Activate your limitless potential by realigning your internal narrative through empowered intention. It sounds actionable, but it's cotton candy, fluffy, sweet, and gone the second you bite down. No nutrition, no structure, just linguistic sugar. We fall for this because the human brain craves patterns. Syntax is a pattern. A beautifully constructed sentence feels like a solved puzzle. Your mind relaxes, your guard drops, and in that moment, the content could be meaningless and you wouldn't notice. But here's the real danger. This illusion doesn't just waste your time. It can replace truth. It can disguise manipulation. It can decorate control. A message wrapped in complexity avoids scrutiny. A bad idea cloaked in sophistication avoids criticism. Because we assume it must have value, just look at how it's dressed. There's a term for this in philosophy, deepity, a statement that seems profound but is actually trivial or meaningless. For example, love is just a word until you feel it. sounds deep. But what does it say? That experience gives meaning to language? Obvious. That language is insufficient? Maybe. Or maybe it's just verbal glitter. This is the performance of thought, the theater of wisdom, where syntax wears the mask of truth. And yet, we reward it. We like the feeling of being near something smart, even if we don't fully understand it. We like the echo of insight, the sense of gravity. We like to be impressed. But being impressed is not the same as being informed. Real depth doesn't always sound complicated. In fact, the deepest truths are often the simplest. This hurts. I'm afraid. We die. We love. These are raw, unadorned. But they hit. Because they carry weight. Not because they're dressed up, but because they're true. But say something real in plain language, and it might be ignored. Say something hollow in flowery language, and it might be applauded. That's the paradox. We've trained ourselves to chase form, not content, to value elegance over honesty, complexity over clarity. But clarity is hard. Clarity requires courage. You can't hide behind complexity when you're being clear. You can't mask your uncertainty. You're naked in front of the idea. So many people don't want that. They want protection. And complex syntax is armor. Even in our own minds we do this. We think in impressive phrases. We narrate our lives in sophisticated loops, avoiding the plain truth of what we're feeling. We overthink instead of feel. We describe instead of experience. We rehearse language instead of honesty. So, how do you know if something has substance, or if it's just syntax in disguise? Ask this. If I strip away the vocabulary, the metaphors, the rhythm, what's left? Can I explain it to a child? Can I use it to make a decision? Can I live by it? If the answer is no, if what's left is only tone, only aesthetic, then maybe it was never real. Maybe it was just a linguistic costume. This doesn't mean all complex language is bad. Some truths are complex. Some ideas require structure and nuance, but the form should serve the truth, not replace it. And too often, we confuse the two. So the next time you hear a sentence that sounds brilliant, pause. Don't ask, does it impress me? Ask, does it feed me? Don't ask if it's poetic. Ask if it's useful. Don't ask if it sounds smart. Ask if it makes you feel something real or think something new. Because the world doesn't need more beautiful nonsense. It needs meaning that breathes. And sometimes, that means saying less, saying plainly, saying honestly, even if it's not impressive, even if it doesn't echo, because substance doesn't always perform, but it always endures. Allusions drift from their origins. You say something clever, drop a reference, a quote, a wink from some shared culture. You assume it lands. You assume they know. You assume that what it means to you is what it now means in the room. But what if it isn't? What if allusions are ghosts, drifting farther from their origins each time we invoke them, smiling as if they still belong, even as they mean something different to every single ear? We speak in fragments of what came before, a Bible verse, a movie quote, a meme, a myth, a metaphor passed down like an heirloom. These references feel like shortcuts to understanding. They suggest connection, shared background, mutual depth. But most of the time, what we're really doing is throwing echoes into the dark, hoping they return with meaning attached. When someone says, "It's my cross to bear," they may be evoking Christian suffering, martyrdom, sacrifice. But the listener might only hear, "They're having a hard time," or worse. They think of something sarcastic or ironic, because that phrase has become a cliché. The origin, centuries of spiritual gravity, fades, and what's left is only tone and guesswork, or take something seemingly simple. It's like Pandora's box. You say it, and you feel clever. You're summoning ancient myth, a cautionary tale about curiosity and unintended consequences. But to one person, it means danger. To another, it means hope, because Pandora's box, once opened, left only hope behind. To someone else, it just sounds like a product, a playlist, a brand. The illusion has become a vessel filled with different meanings, none of which you can control. Illusions drift. That's what they do. They begin with origin and end with impression. And between those two lies a great migration, a long, slow erosion of clarity as references move from sacred to casual, from literal to ironic, from embedded truth to cultural background noise. Quoting Shakespeare used to elevate a conversation. Now, it's often seen as pretentious. Quoting Freud once meant deep psychological analysis. Now, it might just signal outdated ideas. Oedipal doesn't always mean tragic myth. It sometimes just means weird. And Kafkaesque? Half the people using it haven't read Kafka. They just mean confusing and bureaucratic. The ghost of the original remains, but its bones are scattered. We want illusions to be bridges, but often they're mirrors. They reflect the listener, not the speaker. Two people hear the same phrase, but because of different memories, cultures, and emotional histories, they extract entirely different meanings. One person hears Romeo and Juliet and thinks of eternal love. Another thinks of rash teenage tragedy. A third thinks of two bored actors in a high school play. The same reference. Three different emotional universes. Even memes, those new age illusions, suffer the same fate. You post an image, a template, a joke. You think it's hilarious, layered with irony and nostalgia. But someone else sees it and thinks it's juvenile, or mean, or incomprehensible. And because these cultural references mutate faster than they can be archived, even their origins vanish. How many times have you laughed at a meme and realized, weeks later, you didn't actually understand what it was referencing? We build meaning on sand, not stone. And this isn't just confusion, it's vulnerability. Because when you speak in illusions, you're revealing what you see as important, what shaped you, what you still carry. If you quote a book, a song, a proverb, you're exposing your architecture, but the listener might not see the same shape. They might see a ruin instead of a temple. They might mock what you revere. They might nod, pretending to understand, but walk away with a meaning you never intended. Illusions make us feel smarter, more connected, more sophisticated, but they're also risky, because they assume consensus in a world where consensus is an illusion. Even within families, this drift happens. You and your sibling recall a childhood event. You say, "Remember what Dad always said? The early bird gets the worm." But to you, that meant ambition. To them, it meant pressure. To your children, it means nothing. It's just noise from a time they don't inhabit. And yet, we cling to these illusions because they're anchors. They help us feel rooted, feel seen, feel like part of a story that didn't start with us. We reference literature, film, religion, history, not because we expect perfect understanding, but because we need continuity. We need to feel that some part of the past still breathes inside the present. But maybe what we need more is awareness. Awareness that illusion is not communication. It's a gamble. It's a leap across a chasm where the landing point is always uncertain. And in that uncertainty lies both beauty and danger. So what do? We speak with humility. When we use a reference, we pause. We wonder how it might land. We invite clarification, not just reaction. We ask what it means to them. We stop assuming that shared culture is truly shared, because the illusion of mutual understanding is more dangerous than the silence of genuine confusion. And maybe we listen more. When someone alludes to something, we ask where it came from. What does that quote mean to you? What memory is tied to that lyric? What feeling does that proverb carry in your life? In asking, we begin to restore the drift. We bring the illusion closer to its original source, not the historical source, but the emotional one. Because sometimes illusions don't drift from history, they drift from ourselves. We repeat phrases we no longer feel. We quote heroes we no longer believe in. We echo ideas that once moved us, but now only survive out of habit. And those are the most dangerous illusions, the ones we no longer question, no longer examine. They become symbols without story, code without codebook. We wear them like tattoos of forgotten names. So look closely at what you reference, trace it back. Ask if it still means what you think it means. And when someone doesn't understand your illusion, don't correct them. Invite them. Let it be the start of something new, not a test of cultural memory, but a shared rediscovery. Because illusions are not anchors, they're signals, and every signal, sent far enough, changes shape. Meaning dissolves in abundance. At first, a word carries weight. It arrives with force, with gravity. The first time someone says, "I love you," the world stops. You feel it in your bones. The syllables feel sacred, chosen, unrepeatable. But then, over time, the repetition begins. It's said again and again and again. Until one day, the phrase becomes background noise, Something said because it's expected, not because it's felt. And what once rang like a bell now sounds like static. This is the slow erosion of meaning, not through lies, but through abundance. We imagine that sharing something more makes it stronger, more visible, more real. But language doesn't obey the rules of economics. In language, overproduction leads to collapse. A word used too freely becomes a ghost of itself. It's like a photograph that's been copied too many times. The edges blur, the shadows disappear. The detail fades until you're left with a vague outline of what once felt alive. This is why cliché feels so hollow. Take a phrase like thoughts and prayers. It might have once held sincere emotion, but now it floats lifelessly through social media feeds, repeated in moments of tragedy so often that it no longer lands. It no longer moves. It's been stripped of weight through excess. We used it too many times, in too many places, and now it has no home. The same thing happens in relationships. Say, I miss you every hour, and it stops being a revelation. It becomes routine, not because the feeling isn't real, but because the phrase loses its edge. It becomes a placeholder, a stand-in. You can feel someone say it and not mean it, and worse, you can say it yourself and wonder if you meant it, or if it just escaped your mouth by habit. That's the tragedy of abundance. Meaning, once sharp and specific, becomes dull and ambient. Think of language as a candle. The more flames you light from it, the more it flickers. At first, one match from its fire is intimate, illuminating, but light too many and the room becomes glare. You no longer feel the intimacy. You just squint. The warmth is still there, but indistinguishable, unfocused. Words follow this same law. They can reveal. But when repeated carelessly, they blur into white noise. Even in art, this erosion creeps in. When every song says forever, when every poem calls someone my everything, when every script ends in, I can't live without you, we begin to recoil, not because the emotions aren't real, but because we've heard the phrase too often. It no longer surprises. It no longer cuts. It becomes aesthetic wallpaper, a sound we register but no longer believe. Advertising knows this too well. Words like authentic, natural, sustainable, or innovative flood labels and screens until their meanings dissolve. They begin as signals of integrity, but through overuse, they become empty. You don't trust them anymore. You read them and feel nothing. The emotional bank of language, once rich with feeling, collapses when counterfeit phrases flood the system. Even the word sorry decays this way. Used sincerely, it can rebuild a broken bridge, but repeated mechanically, sorry, 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 it becomes dissonant, meaningless. We learn to say it on autopilot. Sorry I'm late. Sorry you feel that way. Sorry, not sorry. And slowly, apology becomes noise instead of medicine. The abundance of the word starves it of substance. This phenomenon infects digital life more than anywhere else. Online, we swim in language. We post, we tweet, we caption, we comment. Love this. So proud. Humbled. These words scatter like confetti, light and bright. But after enough exposure, they carry no emotional weight. Amazing means nothing. Heartbreaking is often not. Literally doesn't mean literally anymore. We've drained the words dry by using them everywhere, for everything. And yet, we still reach for them. We still write them. Because we're terrified of silence, of saying nothing, of leaving a moment unspoken. But sometimes, that restraint is where meaning is reborn. When you stop repeating a word, it starts to recover. It becomes rare again. And in rarity, it regains its power. A compliment you don't hear every day cuts deeper. An I love you, said once at the right moment, becomes unforgettable. There's a reason we remember the first time someone called us beautiful, or brave, or cruel. Because the first time is an ignition, a revelation. After that, it's a memory. But when a word is used too often, by too many people, in too many places, it no longer reveals anything. It just circles. It repeats. And repetition, unchecked, is erosion. Language wants to mean something, but it needs scarcity to do so. Just as gold loses value when the market is flooded, so does truth when every phrase is shouted, shared, recycled. This is not an argument for silence. It's a call for awareness. Speak less, maybe, but speak deeper. Choose your words like a craftsman, not a factory. Say what you mean, and mean it only when it matters. Ask yourself, when you say love, what are you really trying to convey? When you say forever, do you feel the weight of eternity, or just the echo of 1,000 other borrowed promises? Every word you speak adds to the weight or subtracts from it, and most of us are speaking too much, too lightly, with words that once mattered but now drift like leaves. But it's not too late. You can reclaim meaning by slowing down, by letting silence speak where noise used to, by using fewer words, but sharper ones. The less you say, the more each word must carry. And when language becomes rare again, it becomes sacred again. Because in the end, words are not vessels of truth by default. They are only invitations. Their meaning does not live in their spelling, their sound, or their grammar. It lives in the moment they're spoken, the silence around them, and the depth behind them. Meaning dissolves in abundance, but it returns in care, in choice, in restraint. Let your words be few. Let them be real. And let them matter again. Silence grows like a root. Silence doesn't vanish. It grows. Not loudly, not suddenly, but slowly, like a root twisting underground, invisible, persistent, reshaping everything above it without ever being seen. We tend to think of silence as absence, a lack of sound, a pause, an empty space between things that matter. But silence is not empty. It's alive. And what's left unsaid often speaks louder than anything you ever voiced. It begins small, a sentence you meant to say but didn't, a truth you withheld, a question you avoided. At the time, it felt easier, kinder, safer. Maybe you didn't want to hurt someone. Maybe you didn't know how to phrase it. Maybe you thought it wouldn't matter. But silence never stops at that one moment. It burrows. It sends roots into memory, into relationships, into decision after decision made without full understanding. The people around you respond not to what you felt, but to what you said. And when what you said was nothing, they filled in the blanks with their own fears. Because silence is never neutral. It becomes implication. It becomes assumption. And assumptions are almost always built on insecurity, not truth. You didn't say you were angry, so they assumed you were fine. You didn't say you were scared, so they believed you were strong. You didn't say you were in pain, so they kept piling more onto you. And all the while, the silence thickens, grows, spreads, until the person in front of you isn't interacting with you at all, but with a version of you built entirely from the space where your voice should have been. And the tragedy? You start doing the same. You shape your own actions around the very misunderstandings you never corrected. You make decisions in the dark. You withdraw. You compromise. You build a life around a foundation of quiet omissions, all because one moment of withheld truth sent out roots you didn't see until they cracked the floor beneath you. Silence is a seed, and time is the soil. What you don't say today might become someone else's heartbreak tomorrow. What you bury might come back as confusion, resentment, distance. Even love, left unspoken, becomes doubt. Even forgiveness, if never offered aloud, leaves a wound open. We like to believe that people just know, that they'll understand what we meant, that our intentions will shine through the quiet, but they don't. Because people aren't mind readers, they're story builders. They take every silence and try to make sense of it. And when they don't have enough truth to work with, they fill the gaps with their own fears, regrets, and insecurities. Not because they want to misunderstand you, but because the human brain needs closure. It needs answers. And when you offer none, it invents them. So your silence becomes someone else's fiction, a whole internal forest of meaning you never intended, growing unchecked. And by the time you realize how far it's spread, it's too late. The shape of your relationship has changed. The trust has warped. The timeline has already bent under the pressure of all the words you didn't say. You may not even remember what you were silent about, but the other person remembers how that silence made them feel. That's the thing. Silence isn't forgotten. It's remembered in reactions, in choices made without explanation, in the way someone stops calling, or stops trying, or starts building walls without ever saying why. Because maybe they were silent too. Maybe you both were. And now the roots of your mutual silence have tangled together so tightly, you can't tell whose they are anymore. It's just become part of the landscape, and you live inside it. Not unhappily, maybe, but never fully at ease. Because you know something was never said, and you know it mattered. We think speaking up is dangerous, That truth might ruin what silence keeps safe. But silence has a price, and eventually, you pay it with confusion, misalignment, lost connection. Not all silence is cowardice. Sometimes it's trauma. Sometimes it's conditioning. Sometimes it's just exhaustion. But if you don't name the thing, it grows unnamed. And things that grow without names are harder to remove. So speak, even if it's awkward, even if it shakes, even if it risks something. Because one moment of honest speech can cut through years of silent misunderstanding. One sentence can uproot forests of fiction that never should have taken root in the first place. You don't have to say everything, but say what matters. Say what you've been holding. Because while silence might seem small when it begins, its shadow stretches longer than you think. And in the end, what isn't said often changes more than what is. Politeness distorts truth. Politeness is not the same as kindness. It looks similar on the surface. Gentle words, pleasant tone, agreeable gestures. But beneath that softness, something else can hide. A blade wrapped in velvet. A no dressed as a maybe. A dismissal disguised as diplomacy. We were taught to value politeness. From early childhood, we're told, be nice, be pleasant, don't interrupt, don't offend. But often, that social smoothing doesn't lead to honesty. It leads to silence. It leads to repression. It leads to truth being swallowed so that the room stays calm, even as the people inside it slowly break. Because politeness is not truth. It's performance. And performances don't always reflect what's real. Imagine someone saying, it's fine, with a smile, a soft voice, no tension in the words. But everything in their body says otherwise. Their shoulders are stiff. Their eyes avoid yours. Their voice hesitates just slightly. And yet, you accept the words, because they are delivered politely. But politeness doesn't confirm truth. It only confirms effort. Effort to conceal, effort to maintain harmony, effort to protect egos. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room isn't hostility. It's artificial calm. A person can destroy you without ever raising their voice. They can agree while undermining. They can nod while erasing your point. They can say, I understand, and walk away knowing they'll change nothing. Because words can be polished to the point of emptiness, and the more polished they become, the easier they are to believe. This is how manipulation thrives, not through anger, but through charm. Not through cruelty, but through the careful use of pleasantness. You're less likely to question someone who sounds nice. You're less likely to push back when the rejection is coated in sweetness. Think about how often someone said something cruel to you in a nice way. It's not personal, I just think you're not the right fit. You're great, I just don't see us moving forward. I didn't want to hurt you, that's why I lied. The tone is soft, the delivery is smooth, but the content is cutting. The truth was ugly. But instead of naming it, they dressed it in politeness, and somehow that made it harder to confront. Because when someone is aggressive, you know what to defend against. But when someone is polite, your defense is lower. You start to wonder if you're overreacting, if you're the one who misunderstood, if the pain is yours to own because the language was so gentle. This is how gaslighting gets a foothold. Not through rage, but through subtle redirection, through passive voice, through phrases like, I'm sorry you feel that way, through politeness weaponized as control, and sometimes we do this to ourselves. We sugarcoat our own truths because we can't bear to face them raw. Instead of saying, I'm unhappy, we say, I'm just going through a phase. Instead of saying, they hurt me, we say, they didn't mean it. Instead of saying, this isn't working, we say, maybe I just need more time. We dilute the truth in our own minds so that we don't have to act on it. We make it softer so it feels less urgent. But truth that's too soft stops being truth. It becomes comfort, and comfort rarely leads to change. There's nothing wrong with being kind. But kindness is not the same as politeness. Kindness tells the truth with care. Politeness tells you what you want to hear, often at the cost of what you need to hear. You see this in workplaces. People nod in meetings while disagreeing silently. They say, great idea, and then sabotage it. They smile during layoffs. They write emails soaked in civility while hiding resentment in every sentence. And everyone pretends it's functional because the surface is unbroken. But below the surface, trust collapses. You see it in families. Generations avoiding hard conversations, using pleasantries to paper over pain. We don't talk about that. Let's just enjoy the evening. Why bring up the past? And so, the past rots beneath the table, quietly poisoning everything. You see it in relationships. Politeness replacing intimacy. Avoidance replacing honesty. No fights, but no closeness either. Just silence wrapped in smiles. Sometimes the truest love sounds rough. Not cruel, but real. It says, I need more. It says, this hurt me. It says, I can't keep pretending everything's fine. And yes, it might cause discomfort, but truth often does. Truth isn't designed to keep peace. It's designed to make peace possible. Because real peace is not the absence of tension. It's the presence of honesty. So, if you want something real, don't seek polite people. Seek honest ones. People who will tell you what they mean. People whose words match their eyes. People who don't say no problem when there is a problem. People who are kind enough to be clear. And when it's your turn to speak, ask yourself, am I being honest or just avoiding discomfort? Because politeness may win the moment, but truth wins your soul. Context warps certainty. You can say something true, something raw, something sincere, and still, it can become a lie. Not because the words changed, but because the world around them did. Because context isn't just the background of communication. It's the bloodstream, the scaffolding, the force that gives a sentence its soul, or strips it bare. I'm fine, whispered while shaking. I love you, spoken after betrayal. This will pass, said during a permanent loss. These are honest words, and yet, in the wrong moment, they become cruel, hollow, or worse, deceptive. Not because the speaker is lying, but because the moment isn't ready to receive the truth the way it was meant. Context warps certainty. You've felt this. You've said something completely honest, only to watch someone misinterpret it, or reject it, or twist it into something you never intended, and you're left confused. You wonder how truth failed. But it didn't fail. It just wasn't rooted in the right soil. Meaning isn't self-contained. It's not carried in the sentence alone. It breathes through timing, history, emotion, setting. Without that, even the purest words can feel false. Imagine this. A person confesses love on the day their partner is leaving. Not to stay, not to plead, just to speak honestly. But to the one walking away, it sounds manipulative. It feels like a trap. The same words spoken a month earlier might have meant salvation. But now, they fall like bricks. The sentence didn't change. The moment did. This is the tragedy of timing. A truth told too early is ignored. A truth told too late is mistrusted. A truth told too often becomes noise. But the rare truth told at the precise moment the world is listening, that becomes history. That becomes transformation. That becomes art. But how often do we get that timing right? Language is linear, life is not. And so, we're constantly misfiring, trying to apply the right sentence to the wrong moment, offering logic during grief, offering advice during rage, offering apologies when what's needed is silence. We speak truth from our perspective, forgetting that the listener is standing in a different room, different light, different shadows, and through their window, our truth might look like a lie. This is why context is not optional. It's not a detail. It's the container. Say, I forgive you to someone who isn't sorry, and the phrase feels fake. Say, I miss you to someone who's moved on, and it sounds like guilt, not love. Say, it's going to be okay to someone drowning, and they'll hear delusion, not comfort. Even the truest sentence, spoken in the wrong emotional season, withers on contact. This is why public figures often fall, not just because of what they say, but when and how. A joke in one setting becomes offensive in another. A statement of belief becomes a political weapon, depending on who's listening. Truth becomes volatile when it's untethered from its rightful moment. And in a world where everything is clipped, reshared, removed from its frame, context dies. And with it, so does trust. We assume that honesty is enough, that if we tell the truth, we've done our part. But truth without timing is incomplete. You can scream a fact into a storm and no one will hear it. You can whisper wisdom into a silence that doesn't want to know. You can be right and still be rejected. We long for certainty. But certainty is fragile, not because truth is weak, but because the world it lives in is constantly shifting. Imagine trying to balance water on your hand while walking through a hurricane. That's what it's like to hold on to meaning in motion. Context is the wind, it bends everything. Even memory isn't safe. A moment that felt sacred once can feel foolish later. You can reread an old message and wonder how it ever felt real. Not because the message lied, but because you've changed. Your history changed. The emotional coordinates shifted, and now that truth doesn't land. That's the cruelty of truth. It needs constant recalibration. It needs alignment, not just in words, but in moment, mood, meaning. Otherwise, it collapses into contradiction. This is why silence can be more honest than speaking. Because silence waits. It listens. It watches the context before choosing to move. But words, once released, can't undo themselves. Once spoken in the wrong frame, they can't go back. They become ghosts of what they meant to say. So what can we do? Do we stay quiet forever? Do we fear expression because the world may not be ready? No. But we can slow down. We can ask not just what is true, but when it's true, where it belongs, who it will touch. A message delivered in the wrong moment isn't just ineffective, it's sometimes harmful. And we must hold that risk with reverence. Speak, yes, but speak into the world, not at it. Tune yourself to the context. Feel the shape of the moment. Sense the readiness of the listener. Truth is not a hammer, it's a key. But every lock is different, and forcing a key into the wrong lock doesn't open anything. It breaks both. So maybe wisdom isn't just knowing what's true, but knowing when it will be heard, when it will heal, when it will hold. And maybe compassion is knowing when to wait, when to let silence speak until the moment blooms. Because when a sentence meets the right moment, it becomes more than words. It becomes clarity, movement, change. But until then, even the most honest sentence, spoken too soon or too late, might still feel like a lie. Translation, rewrites, reality. When you translate something, you think you're swapping words, lifting one term from one language and finding its mirror in another. But translation isn't substitution, it's transformation. Because words are not just labels, they're coordinates in the reality of a culture. And when you change the words, you don't just shift the language, you reshape the very world those words once belonged to. Take the simple word home. In English, it can mean comfort, origin, shelter, or even identity. But translate it into Japanese, and you might get uchi, which suggests an inner circle, a private sphere of belonging. In German, it becomes Heimat, a concept laced with history, geography, and deep-rooted emotional memory. In Arabic, Watan may signify a homeland tied to blood and honor. So when you translate home, what are you really saying? What pieces of its soul are left behind? What new meanings are stitched in? Because every word lives inside a web of emotion, experience, custom, time. And that web is different in every language. When you move between tongues, you carry the shape of a sentence, but the space it once occupied, the memories, the echoes, the unsaid, is gone. A joke that kills in one language dies flat in another. A proverb that teaches wisdom becomes nonsensical. A poem that once felt like touching God now feels mechanical, bloodless, wrong, and you wonder, was it really ever beautiful? Or was its beauty trapped in a language that cannot be replicated? Translation rewrites not just the words, but the physics of the thought behind them. Think of how languages handle time. In English, time moves in lines. We talk about the future ahead and the past behind. But in Aymara, an indigenous South American language, the past is in front of you because it's known, seen, and the future is behind because it is unknowable. In Hopi, there are no tenses the way we understand them, only cycles and context. So, when you translate "I will go" into these tongues, you're not just shifting a verb, you're bending time. You're rebuilding the metaphysics of movement. Translation isn't innocent, it isn't neutral, it carries power. It decides what gets preserved and what gets erased. Consider how sacred texts are translated. A single word in Hebrew or Sanskrit or classical Arabic can carry layers of sound, mystery, spiritual gravity. But when translated, translators must choose literal meaning, poetic feeling, or theological agenda. One version of a verse may call for mercy, another for justice, another for fire. And people build entire worldviews on the translated version. unaware that other translations live in parallel, whispering different truths. This isn't just philosophical, it's political. When colonizers translated indigenous languages, they didn't just convert vocabulary, they reconstructed reality. Words for kinship, land, ritual, spirit were often stripped, simplified, or mistranslated into the colonizer's framework. A medicine ceremony becomes witchcraft. A communal land becomes property. A sacred mountain becomes terrain. And with each translation, a universe collapses into a smaller, flatter one. We call this understanding. But is it? Or is it conquest disguised as communication? Even in everyday life, the illusion persists. You ask someone, "How do you say love in your language?" They tell you the closest word. You smile. You write it down. But did you really learn anything? What if that word carries different burdens, different expectations, different silences? What if in their world, love is obligation, not emotion? What if it's sacrifice, not romance? What if the word you think you now know has never meant what it means to you? Translation gives us access, but it also gives us mirrors. We think we're looking into someone else's world, but often we're just projecting our own ideas onto a reflection. Because true translation, if it exists at all, requires empathy deeper than language. It requires knowing what is felt, not just what is said. It means asking not, "What does this word mean?" but "What does this world believe?" And that's not something a dictionary can offer. That's something you earn by listening, by dwelling, by living inside the grammar of another mind. That's why machine translation will always fail in the deepest sense. It may be fast, it may be accurate, but it cannot feel. It cannot grieve when a metaphor is lost. It cannot ache when the rhythm of a prayer breaks in the new tongue. It cannot mourn what cannot cross the border of syntax, because not everything survives the crossing. A lullaby translated loses its cradle. A joke loses its mischief. A farewell loses its weight. We try to compensate, we explain, we annotate, we footnote our feelings. But the truth is, something is always sacrificed, and we must choose. Precision or spirit, clarity or resonance, literalness or love. Translation is a form of authorship. Every translator is a builder of a parallel world. They carry the burden of impossible choices. Which metaphor to preserve, which rhythm to rewrite, which silence to keep sacred, and which to fill with approximation. And yet, despite the distortion, despite the drift, we translate. Because we must. Because language is not a fortress, it's a bridge. And if the bridge is imperfect, if it sways and creaks and sometimes leads us astray, it is still better than being stranded in silence. So when you read a translation of a novel, a lyric, a phrase, remember this. You are not reading what was written. You are reading a new world born from the old one. The words are not footprints, they're echoes. And echoes, by nature, are altered by the spaces they pass through. Translation doesn't just alter language, it reshapes perception, it rewires thought. It doesn't tell you what was, it tells you what could be, through the lens of someone else's voice, someone else's map of reality. So treat it with wonder, and with doubt, and with reverence, because every translated sentence is not just a message, it's a new reality, born at the intersection of loss and intention. Similes merge unrelated things. When we say one thing is like another, we think we're helping understanding. We think we're offering clarity, but what we're actually doing is performing a kind of mental alchemy, a quiet trick. We fuse two separate realities together, two different objects, feelings, or experiences, and pretend that they now belong to each other. A simile isn't just a comparison, it's a cognitive welding torch. The moment you say grief is like a storm, you've invited every property of a storm into the realm of sorrow. Chaos, rain, thunder, passing. And whether you meant to or not, you've begun to reshape the truth of grief itself. This is the secret power of similes. They dissolve the boundaries between ideas. They are not neutral, they're transformative. And they act so quickly, so invisibly, that we often don't see what they've done until much later, if ever. In language, nothing remains untouched. Say something is like something else, and both begin to change. The mind cannot fully separate what it has once merged. Think of how we describe emotions. We say anger is like fire, and suddenly, anger becomes something that burns, destroys, spreads. We forget that anger can also be quiet, calculated, cold. The simile didn't just help us understand, it narrowed the emotional spectrum, boxed it in with borrowed imagery. Love is like a drug. Then love becomes addictive, dangerous, euphoric, harmful. Do we still see love for what it is, or only what we've made it resemble? Similes are illusions that feel like insight. They bring us the comfort of structure. The unknown gets framed by the known. If you've never lost someone, but someone tells you grief is like drowning, you begin to assume that's what it must feel like. That image carves itself into your mental map. And then, when grief finally finds you, you go looking for water. But maybe grief, for you, isn't drowning. Maybe it's falling, or freezing, or silence. But the simile preloaded your expectation. And so, it might distort the experience you were meant to live fully. It happens with people too. Say someone is like a machine, and suddenly we forget their softness, their exhaustion, their humanness. Call a child like a sponge, and you begin to see them only as absorbers, not as agents. Say, life is like a game, and now winning matters, strategy matters, roles matter, but perhaps you've erased the parts of life that are beyond competition. Similes are not just poetic devices, they are philosophical edits. They tell us not just what something is like, but what it ought to be, and in doing so, they begin to rewrite the thing itself. The brain is eager to connect things. It loves shortcuts. It sees 2 points and builds a bridge, even if the terrain underneath is unstable. Similes are those bridges, but walk across them too often, and the land they connect begins to erode. You forget what stood there before the bridge was built. Similes are also sticky. Say something once, and it echoes. If a teacher says, your mind is like a muscle, you grow up believing that learning is exercise, growth requires pain, and rest is laziness. That simile will shape your habits, your self-talk, even your guilt. If someone says time is like money, you'll start budgeting your hours, treating presents like currency, and feeling bankrupt when you're idle. But time isn't money. It isn't stored. It isn't earned. But now, you live as if it were, because the simile made it real. This is why similes are not innocent. They're maps. Maps we use to navigate experience. And bad maps mislead. They shrink the world. They make detours invisible. They take a rich, chaotic landscape and reduce it to an analogy that fits neatly in the palm. Useful maybe, but dangerous too, because you start to trust the map more than the territory. Even politics weaponizes similes. A protester becomes like a virus, and suddenly, public sentiment turns. A leader is like a savior, and now flaws vanish. An ideology is like a cancer, and dialogue becomes impossible. Similes are not just description, they are judgment, framing, compression. Once a thing is like another thing, we start to treat it as if it is that thing. The line blurs. The metaphor ossifies into belief. We even use similes on ourselves. I feel like a failure. I'm like a ghost. I'm like a ticking bomb. These are not metaphors for clarity. They are self-hypnosis. They begin to alter how we see ourselves. The simile becomes a mirror, and the more we stare into it, the more we reflect it back. Over time, we no longer feel like a ghost. We are the ghost. The language becomes identity. So what's the way out? Awareness. You don't need to stop using similes, but you need to recognize what they do. Every time you say, this is like that, ask yourself, in what way? And what am I losing in this comparison? What is the cost of this clarity? Because clarity that erases complexity is just another form of blindness. You can hold both, the thing and the comparison. You can say, grief is like a storm, but also remember, it is not only a storm, it is also a shadow, a hunger, a rebuilding, a silence. The simile must never replace the reality. It should open a door, not build a room. Similes are the mind's way of holding the unfamiliar, but don't let them become cages. Let them be scaffolding. Let them fall away when the truth arrives, because the world is full of things that are not like anything else. They are themselves, strange, singular, untranslatable, and the more you can sit with them without reaching for a comparison, the closer you are to touching something real. Vocabulary shapes belief. You think your beliefs are your own, that your convictions come from experience, from reason, from choice. But what if they came from vocabulary? From the very words you were taught to use, and more importantly, the ones you were never taught at all. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. You cannot think what you cannot name. And the words you possess are not just tools, they're limits. Your vocabulary is the fence around your imagination. And everything beyond that fence, you may never even know it's there. From birth, you inherit a language, a set of sounds and symbols, rules and meanings, crafted long before you ever open your mouth. And that language does more than help you communicate. It shapes your perception of reality. There are entire emotions in other cultures that your language has no word for. Not because you don't feel them, but because you were never taught to recognize them. A Japanese word like natsukashi captures the bittersweet ache of nostalgic joy. A Portuguese word like saudade speaks to a longing so profound it has no clear English twin. If you don't have the word, can you still fully feel the thing? Maybe. But can you understand it? Can you think it clearly, hold it, dissect it, communicate it? That's the trap. Because thought feels infinite, but it's always cradled inside the language we use. You think you're free, but you're spelling your beliefs with a limited alphabet. It's not just about exotic words. It's about how every language frames reality. In English we say, I broke the vase. In Japanese one might say, the vase broke itself. Same event. Different implication. One assigns blame. One removes the actor. Now ask, how often has the grammar of your mother tongue quietly sculpted your guilt, or your pride, or your worldview? You think you're choosing your beliefs, but maybe you're just selecting from a menu written before you were born. This is why propaganda works. Not by changing what you see, but by changing the words you're allowed to use. Replace civilian death with collateral damage. Replace lies with misinformation. Replace rage with passion. And you alter not just the tone, but the moral structure of an event. Language sanitizes. It manipulates. It elevates or erases entire truths. And if the only words you have for protest are riots and chaos, then justice begins to look like a threat before you've even formed an opinion of your own. This is how vocabulary shapes belief, not through force, but through framework. We think of language as a mirror to the mind, but more often, it's a mold. It tells you which categories exist, what binaries matter, what is real, and what is too unspoken to be real. And every word you use drags behind it centuries of context, of bias, of cultural weight you didn't agree to, but that you now carry. Even personal beliefs, spirituality, identity, morality, are filtered through this lens. Try explaining a mystical experience in purely scientific terms, or describe grief using only medical vocabulary. You can't. Because some realities stretch beyond the frame your words provide. And when they do, they feel blurry, wrong, untrustworthy. So, you discard them. Not because they're false, but because your language lacks the shape to hold them. That's how beliefs are controlled. Not by argument, but by architecture. By deciding what you're even able to think clearly about. And this doesn't just imprison, it isolates. If your internal world contains feelings no one around you has words for, how do you not feel alone? If you experience something but can't name it, others might tell you it doesn't exist. And slowly, you start to believe them. This is why finding the right word can feel like a revelation. Not because the thing didn't exist before, but because now it has form. Now it belongs to you. Naming is claiming. When you give something language, you give it legitimacy. You give it breath. You pull it from the formless into the factual. And so, your vocabulary becomes your map, not just of what is, but of what can be. The fewer words you know, the smaller your world becomes. The fewer definitions you carry, the more your beliefs default to what you've been handed. But when your language expands, your consciousness follows. You start seeing distinctions where before there were only blur lines. You begin to feel more precisely, reflect more deeply, speak more honestly. So, the question isn't just, what do you believe? It's, what words are shaping your beliefs without your permission? What realities are just outside your reach? Not because they're unreachable, but because you don't yet know how to speak them? If you want to reclaim your thoughts, start there. Not with ideology, not with dogma, but with language. Stretch your vocabulary and you stretch your soul. Learn the words that make you uncomfortable. Discover the ones you were never taught. Find names for your shadows, your subtleties, your unnamed truths, because until you do, you're not thinking freely. You're thinking within the cage of someone else's dictionary. And maybe the key to your freedom has always been a word you haven't found yet. Narratives. Self-destruct and clarity. We build stories to make sense of things. That's how the mind survives chaos. It strings moments together, connects dots that were never meant to align, and declares, "This is who I am. This is what happened. This is why." Narratives comfort us. They give shape to pain, coherence to memory, identity to the swirl of time, but there's a paradox no one warns you about. The clearer the story becomes, the more airtight, the more polished, the more precise, it begins to die, because life isn't sharp. It's blurry. It's messy. It's layered with contradiction. And every time you squeeze a story tighter to make it clean, you lose the mess that made it real. Narratives self-destruct in clarity. They begin as wonder, as questions, as feelings you can't quite name. But over time, we demand structure. We want to know what the story means. Who was wrong? Who was right? Where the turning point was? What the lesson is? But meaning isn't always linear. It isn't always fixed. And when you lock a story into a perfect shape, it starts suffocating. Because now, it can't breathe. It can't grow. It can't surprise you anymore. Think about the story you tell yourself about your childhood. At some point, it becomes a sentence. My parents did their best. I was the black sheep. I never belonged. And maybe that sentence is useful. Maybe it helps you function. But it also becomes a wall. Because now, anything that contradicts it, any memory that doesn't fit, is discarded, edited, smoothed away. The story becomes so sharp that nothing outside its edges can survive. And so, you live not in reality, but in a curated myth. The same thing happens in relationships. I was the villain. They were the narcissist. We were soulmates who met too soon. But people don't fit into lines like that. They're chapters layered on top of chapters. They're pages written in invisible ink. And when you reduce them to a role, you silence their complexity. You turn them into a character in your film instead of a person in their own. And the worst part? You do this to yourself, too. You summarize your whole being into a few clean labels. I'm an overthinker. I'm not lovable. I'm resilient. Even the flattering ones still shrink you. Still wrap your infinite variations into one container. Still kill the wonder of what you might be just to protect the comfort of what you've already decided. But clarity is seductive. It feels good to say, I figured it out. To believe the arc is closed. To feel the story land in a final sentence. Because we want closure more than we want truth. We want the end of the story, even if it's a lie, even if it was never meant to end. This is why trauma narratives can become cages. You survive something, and to make sense of it, you build a story around it. That story saves you, but eventually it starts to limit you, because it defines you. And the longer you wear it, the harder it becomes to remember who you were before the story, and who you could be beyond it. You see this in faith, in science, in politics, in every system built on story. The more precisely a belief is stated, the more it loses the vastness that gave it life. The more exact the doctrine, the less room there is for doubt, for mystery, for the divine chaos that truth often hides inside. A story becomes a belief becomes a rule, and a rule becomes a prison. So what do? We loosen our grip. We let our stories be rough drafts. We say, this is what I think, for now. This is what I felt then. This is what I know, until I learn more. We stop seeking clarity as the goal and begin seeing it as a phase, because real wisdom doesn't conclude, it expands. It holds opposing truths without rushing to resolve them. It sits in uncertainty without panic. It allows the story to stay soft, to stay human, to keep breathing. And yes, that's harder. Yes, it's messier. Yes, it leaves you vulnerable. But it also leaves you free to rewrite yourself, free to rediscover others, free to wonder again. Because the point of a story was never to end wonder. It was to help you survive long enough to begin it. Echoes outlast their source. Somewhere, long ago, someone said something real, maybe in pain, maybe in clarity, maybe in hope. Their voice trembled, their words carried weight, and then, those words traveled, repeated, quoted, shared. The sentence broke free from its source. It echoed, and now, That same phrase floats everywhere, but the soul that once birthed it is gone. This is how echoes outlast their source. It's the strange way language survives, divorced from the breath that first gave it life. Something deeply felt becomes culturally hollow. A private truth becomes a public soundbite. A raw whisper becomes a slogan. And over time, no one remembers where it came from. No one remembers why it was said. They only remember how it sounds. Think of the phrases you've heard 1,000 times. Stay strong. Be the change. It's darkest before dawn. They feel timeless. But that's the illusion. They weren't born timeless. They were born in a moment. One person, one situation, one fragile truth. Someone once meant them, but now they drift through mouths that don't know their origin. And because they echo louder than the voice that spoke them, they begin to lose shape, to lose weight. They become habits of speech, not acts of meaning. It happens in movements. A protest cry born of urgency becomes a hashtag. A sacred chant becomes a marketing campaign. A wartime promise becomes a brand slogan. The words survive, but they no longer bleed. They no longer pulse with the pain or purpose that once fueled them. They are relics now, beautiful, powerful, but distant. Even history folds into this pattern. Never again. A phrase spoken after unspeakable horror. But now, repeated so often, it's background noise, a reflex. Still important, but disconnected. I have a dream. A speech that shook the world, now recited, carved in stone, printed on mugs. But do we feel what it meant, or just admire how it sounds? This is the erosion of meaning through echo. You've seen it in your own life. A phrase someone once said to you, maybe a parent, a lover, a friend. At the time, it hit you like lightning. It changed how you saw yourself. But now, you repeat it out of habit. You say it to others, but it doesn't burn the way it did. The fire dimmed. The words kept going. That's the haunting part. Language has momentum. Once a phrase begins to echo, it gathers velocity. It leaves behind its birthplace. It becomes part of culture, not memory. And we forget that it once had skin and blood. It happens in religion. Holy texts filled with verses that once carried sacred force, now recited daily, rhythmically, often without reflection. The prayers still echo, but the source is buried under centuries of repetition. The flame becomes ash. The voice becomes ritual. And sometimes, the echo completely betrays the source. A quote is taken out of context. A line is misattributed. A sentence meant as irony becomes doctrine. Something fragile becomes weaponized, and we start to live by shadows of ideas, half-truths wearing the mask of wisdom. Even in love, this happens. A pet name repeated so often it loses its intimacy. An apology rehearsed into insincerity. A promise that used to mean everything, but after 1,000 echoes means nothing at all. The words survived, the feeling did not. We underestimate how powerful this is. The repetition of a phrase can keep it alive, but also hollow it out. It's the illusion of meaning, the appearance of truth. Like singing an anthem whose history you no longer remember. You feel proud. But what are you proud of? The echo or the origin? Sometimes we hold on to phrases not because they're still true, but because they used to be, because we once needed them. And we confuse familiarity for relevance. We quote things because they feel good in the mouth, not because they still speak to the moment we're in. There's danger in that. Because once a phrase becomes detached from its source, it can be used for anything. A quote about freedom can be used to sell shoes. A line about justice can be used to justify violence. A message about peace can be turned into silence in the face of suffering. Echoes are powerful. They outlive people. They outlive events. But that's why they must be handled with care. They are not just decorations. They are legacies. And legacies deserve reverence. So, how do we know when we're speaking an echo and not its meaning? We pause. We ask, do I know where this came from? Do I know what it meant in its birth? Does it still carry that meaning now? Or am I just recycling sound? Am I saying this to connect or to perform? Because language can be sacred, but only if it remains rooted. If you quote something, live it. If you chant something, feel it. If you repeat something, ask if it still fits. If it still belongs. If it still serves truth. Otherwise, let it rest. Let it return to silence. because not every phrase deserves to echo forever. Some words were never meant to be immortal. Some meanings die when the moment ends. And if we keep repeating them after the soul is gone, we are not honoring the source. We are erasing it. Syntax builds its own truth. A lie spoken with certainty is more powerful than a truth whispered in doubt. And when that lie is dressed in perfect syntax, when the subject aligns with the verb, when the rhythm flows like water, when the voice is polished, confident, complete, it no longer feels like deception. It feels like truth, because syntax, in all its invisible authority, doesn't just deliver ideas, it manufactures belief. This is the quiet weapon of language. Its structure, before its meaning, commands trust. We are wired to hear clarity as correctness, to mistake elegance for evidence, to believe that if something sounds right, it is right. But that is a dangerous assumption, because syntax doesn't need reality to function. It needs only rules, and rules can be followed to say anything. You've seen it before. A motivational speaker says, "You are the architect of your destiny." The sentence is clean, crisp, symmetrical, and so we nod, even if we don't feel like architects at all. Or a politician declares, "Freedom is under attack." Again, the syntax is undeniable. It lands with weight, regardless of what freedom means, or who is attacking it, or whether the threat even exists. Syntax carries the authority of form, and form bypasses scrutiny. We trust sentences that are well constructed more than the messy stammers of lived truth. A survivor of trauma may struggle to explain. Their words may come jagged, interrupted, contradictory. But a fabricated story told with flawless pacing and practiced pauses? That sounds more believable. Not because it's more real, but because it's more structured. This is why propaganda works. Not just because it appeals to fear or identity, but because it is grammatically confident. It's full of short, repeatable sentences, clear agents, clear actions. They hate us. We will win. Truth is fake. Syntax is stripped down and sharpened, and the human mind, craving patterns, salutes the rhythm. Syntax doesn't describe truth. It performs it. It stages it. It builds a world with scaffolding so clean you don't look behind it. A sentence like, "Everything happens for a reason," is grammatically airtight. It comforts because it flows. It's repeated because it's easy. But behind its symmetry is a philosophical void. A claim with no proof, no nuance, no room for chaos. Still, we believe it because it arrives complete. This happens even in relationships. Someone texts, "I'm fine, don't worry about me." The grammar is clean, the period seals it shut. But you know something's off. The real truth lives between the words, in the tone, the timing, the choice of syntax. If instead they wrote, "IDK, maybe just tired, I guess," the fractured form would feel more honest. But we often treat the polished lie as more real than the broken truth. We do it to ourselves. When you journal, when you narrate your past, when you tell your story to a friend, you structure it. You edit. You arrange. You find a way to make it coherent. But life is not coherent. Syntax is. And the more you arrange the chaos into sentences, the more you start to believe the version you constructed, not the one you lived. You say, "I always knew I'd survive that." But in reality, you didn't. You were drowning. You were afraid. You had no plan. Still, you narrate survival with a confidence that wasn't there at the time. Syntax builds the memory backwards. It rewrites fear as foresight, doubt as destiny. This is why confessions lose power in formal language. Say, "I regret my actions," and it sounds like a statement from a podium. Say, "I shouldn't have done it, and I can't stop thinking about it, and I don't know what's wrong with me." Now that's messy. That's real. Syntax cleans things up, but in doing so, it can sanitize guilt, scrub away humanity, and present a version of truth that's smoother than it should be. Even the justice system is built on this illusion. A lawyer's opening statement, delivered with precision, grammar, logic, and pause, can cast doubt on a witness whose testimony was raw and stumbling. Not because one is more true, but because one obeyed the laws of language more effectively. We're taught to admire good writing, but we should be cautious of how easily it can mislead, because when the structure is perfect, our minds relax. We stop questioning. We accept the sentence as real because it looks like reality. Syntax is a costume truth can wear, or discard. Even AI like me does it. I can generate sentence after sentence, polished, persuasive, grammatically correct. But does that make it true? No. It makes it believable. And believability is not the same as honesty. It is, in fact, the most dangerous mimic of honesty, because it leaves you no friction to resist. There's a reason why spiritual revelations, trauma processing, artistic breakthroughs, and moments of awakening often arrive in half-sentences, unfinished thoughts, grammatical chaos. They don't fit into neat syntax because they're too big, too raw, too real. Reality isn't always a sentence. Sometimes it's a scream. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's a thought with no words at all. And yet, we still worship language. We quote, we caption, we script, we construct statements to prove to ourselves that we're okay. I'm moving on. It wasn't meant to be. I know what I want now. These are grammatically perfect conclusions, but life rarely ends with a period. It's full of ellipses, interruptions, contradictions. Syntax wants closure. Life resists it. So, be careful with sentences that feel too finished. When someone speaks too smoothly about a wound, ask what they're not saying. When a belief is repeated like a mantra, examine whether its structure is stronger than its substance. When a thought feels true just because it's well written, interrogate it, break it. Strip the grammar and ask, what survives without the syntax? Because the truth doesn't always speak in perfect form. And if you're not listening closely, you might believe the sentence more than the soul who spoke it. Familiar sounds breed credibility. You think you're judging truth. You think when someone speaks, you weigh their words, test their logic, question their meaning. But in reality, you're often responding to something far simpler. Tone, cadence, familiarity. Not what's being said, but how it's being said. And if the voice sounds familiar, if it echoes the rhythm of authority, the pace of calm certainty, the tone of someone you once trusted, then your defense is lower. You let it in. Because the human brain, above all else, trusts what feels known. This is the hidden architecture of persuasion. A politician may speak utter nonsense, but if their delivery mirrors past leaders who made you feel safe, your guard will drop. A YouTuber might spout conspiracies, but if their speech pattern mimics the tone of your favorite teacher growing up, you'll feel like you're learning. A podcast host may have no real evidence, but if their voice is paced like a professor, laced with dramatic pauses, you'll lean in. Not because they have proven anything, but because the sound feels like truth. This is why propaganda works best when sung like a lullaby. Why con artists sound charming. Why cult leaders don't need to make sense. They need only to sound like someone who does. You don't need facts when you have tone. You need only the music of belief. This is not stupidity. It's biology. The brain evolved to recognize tone before it recognized content. Before we had language, we had voices. And we learned to survive by knowing when a voice meant comfort or danger. It's why you can feel comforted by a commercial jingle, even if the product is meaningless. Why a slogan delivered with perfect rhythm sticks, while a complex truth gets ignored. Why politicians repeat the same empty phrases, hope, change, family values, because it's not the meaning that matters, it's the frequency, the emotional signal embedded in the sound. Truth becomes secondary. Resonance becomes primary. Even in arguments, tone trumps logic. Say the right thing in the wrong tone, and people recoil. Say the wrong thing in the right tone, and they nod. This is why sarcasm cuts, why sincerity heals, why a lie can sound more true than the truth itself. We've been trained, not by school, but by experience, to respond to tone first, meaning second. This is especially true in moments of stress. When you're anxious, afraid, or overwhelmed, you don't evaluate information with your rational mind. You reach for what feels familiar. And familiarity often arrives wrapped in tone. The voice that calms you becomes the voice you believe. It doesn't matter if it's accurate. It matters if it sounds like home. Think of how cults recruit. They don't begin with doctrine. They begin with comfort, with tone, with the cadence of reassurance, the softness of inclusion, the calm rhythm of someone who gets it. The language is carefully crafted to feel like something you've already heard. And once you feel that warmth, the message slips in through the side door. Logic doesn't matter. Familiarity has already done the work. Even misinformation campaigns understand this. They don't try to overwhelm you with proof. They mimic tone, repeating phrases you already believe, mimicking the tempo of your tribe. They echo the structure of things you've heard before, until the new lie feels like an old truth, and your brain, comforted by the sound, accepts the substance. You never notice the switch. We see this everywhere. A soft-spoken voice delivering a brutal opinion will be excused. An impassioned voice stating a truth may be dismissed as aggressive. A monotone voice can make brilliance feel dull. A charismatic tone can dress up emptiness as insight. The container becomes more important than the content. This is why you can scroll endlessly and only stop when a voice feels right. Not when it's saying something new, but when it feels like something you've already believed, because your mind prefers familiar lies to unfamiliar truths. And sound is the fastest shortcut to familiarity. But here's the danger. If you begin to equate tone with truth, you can be led anywhere. You'll believe the calmest person in the room, even if they're wrong. You'll distrust the trembling voice, even if they're right. You'll follow the confidence, not the substance. And that makes you vulnerable, not just to manipulation, but to self-deception. Because this applies to your own inner voice too. You believe your thoughts when they sound familiar, when they echo past narratives, when they feel right. But feeling right is often just repetition. If you've told yourself for years that you're not enough, that you'll fail, that you don't deserve better, that voice becomes the one you trust. Not because it's true, but because it's yours, because it's always been there. So what's the escape? You must learn to separate tone from truth. Listen for the content behind the comfort. Ask yourself, not just, does this sound right? But, is this right regardless of how it sounds? Learn to recognize when a voice is stroking your expectations, rather than challenging them. Learn to lean into voices that may feel strange, even uncomfortable, because discomfort is often the sign that something new is trying to reach you. Truth doesn't always wear a familiar coat. Sometimes it arrives in a voice that trembles, in a tone that stumbles, in a rhythm you don't yet know how to trust. And if you can train your ears to listen anyway, to focus not on the music, but on the meaning, you can begin to reclaim your mind from the hypnotic spell of familiarity. Because in a world overflowing with voices, online, offline, in your head, the most dangerous lie is not the one shouted. It's the one that feels like a song you already know by heart. Polished lies resemble wisdom. Some lies don't shout. They whisper, draped in elegance, spoken with perfect calm, wrapped in rhythm that lulls you into agreement. And the more graceful they sound, the truer they feel. You think wisdom is about content, but often it's about presentation. You hear a voice that flows, a sentence that glows with polish, and you relax. You nod, you accept. Because beauty feels like truth. Eloquence feels like evidence. But they aren't. A well-spoken lie is still a lie, but once it's dressed in grace, it becomes harder to spot and harder to resist. The world is full of polished phrases, phrases that wrap deception in syntax so elegant, you don't just believe them, you defend them, you repeat them, you build your life around them. Everything happens for a reason. Good things come to those who wait. If you work hard, success is guaranteed. They sound like ancient truths, but often they're just cultural lullabies. Phrases passed down not because they're real, but because they're comforting, easy to repeat, beautiful to hear, and sometimes deadly to believe. Because while wisdom helps you navigate reality, polished lies help you escape it. And the more poetic the sentence, the more easily it bypasses your defenses. This is how manipulation works, not by brute force, but by style. A speaker can dress a cruel idea in ornate language, and suddenly it sounds noble. A government can label oppression as security, and it becomes a virtue. A manipulator can justify abuse as tough love, and now the victim feels guilty for wanting to leave. The lie didn't change, only the clothing did. We mistake polish for proof. But truth doesn't always shine. Real wisdom is often messy, hesitant. It pauses. It contradicts itself. It doesn't always wrap up neatly with a quote or a slogan, and that makes it harder to sell. But the world doesn't reward difficulty. It rewards smoothness. If it flows, it flies. And so, the best lies don't feel like lies. They feel like scripture. They're coded in certainty. They rhyme. They appeal to emotion while pretending to appeal to reason. And once accepted, they sink deep, deeper than raw facts ever could. That's the danger. Because once you mistake beauty for truth, you stop checking. You stop asking. You hear a speech, a sermon, a statement, and you nod. Not because you've understood, but because it sounded wise. and your brain rewards you for it. Psychologically, we prefer fluency. We trust what sounds easy, what flows without effort. So, when someone lies with grace, we trust the fluency more than the meaning. It's not stupidity, it's wiring. But it leaves us vulnerable. Think of how often we've followed charismatic leaders, elegant writers, articulate speakers, only to realize too late that behind the polish was rot. Polished lies are addictive. They give us answers that feel good. They give us frameworks that soothe us. They wrap complexity in simplicity and hand it back with a smile. And we accept it because the truth, by comparison, feels jagged and uncertain. But here's the hard question. How much of what you believe? Do you believe because it sounded beautiful when you first heard it? How much of your worldview is built not on truth, but on phrasing? We all have beliefs we borrowed, beliefs that entered our minds not through evidence, but through language so graceful we didn't think to challenge it. It's everywhere, in religion, in politics, in relationships, in the quiet narratives we tell ourselves just to make it through the day. And the worst part? Once a lie is coded in wisdom, it's harder to unlearn, because to remove it, you don't just have to let go of the idea, you have to let go of the comfort, the elegance, the identity you built around it. You begin to question not just the sentence, but the version of yourself that believed it. And that hurts. But it's necessary. Because unlearning a polished lie is the only path to real wisdom. Wisdom that's earned, not inherited. Wisdom that limps, that doubts, that stutters, but still tells the truth. So, listen closely. Not just to what people say, but to how they say it. Ask yourself, is this truth or is this theater? Is this clarity or is it camouflage? Am I convinced by the content or seduced by the style? Because wisdom doesn't always come in perfect form. Sometimes it's awkward, sometimes it's slow, sometimes it doesn't rhyme. But it leaves you changed. Whereas lies, no matter how polished, leave you comforted, but hollow. You deserve better than hollow. So don't worship the shine. Look for the weight. Test every elegant phrase before you kneel before it. Because beauty is not a promise, and grace is not a guarantee. Only truth, however messy, can hold you when everything else falls apart. Metaphors become prisons. We survive by comparing, by turning the unknown into something we almost understand. A storm into a battle, a heart into a clock, a mind into a machine. This is how we make the vast feel familiar, through metaphor. We say grief is a wave, love is a fire, time is a thief, the self is a mirror, the world is a stage, and it works, at first. Because metaphor makes the impossible describable. It lets us speak the unspeakable, translate experience into symbols, turn chaos into a sentence we can hold. Without metaphor, we're mute. But with it, we risk becoming blind, because metaphors are not just comparisons, they're cages. You build them to explain, then they solidify, and what began as poetry becomes law. What started as the brain is like a computer becomes the brain is a computer, and suddenly you stop questioning. You start coding yourself, diagnosing yourself, rewriting yourself in binary. You reduce your emotions to errors, your thoughts to programs, your trauma to corrupted files. The metaphor becomes the model becomes the reality, and the reality shrinks to fit the metaphor. Think of how we talk about time. We say, we spend it, we waste it, we save it, as if time were money, and so we panic when we're not productive. We feel guilt for resting. We measure life in units, hours, days, deadlines, not moments, not meaning. Because the metaphor taught us how to feel, and we never noticed it was just a metaphor. We do this with love. We say, they broke my heart. I fell for them. I let them in. As if hearts were glass, love was gravity, people were buildings. And so, we relate to each other through damage, through trespass, through risk and reward. But what if love isn't a fall? What if it's a becoming, a resonance, a weather system? The words you choose shape the feelings you believe are possible. And over time, you forget they were ever choices. You live inside metaphor without windows, and slowly it becomes a prison. This is why people stay stuck. They tell themselves, I'm carrying baggage. I'm fighting demons. I'm climbing a mountain. And those metaphors, meant to motivate, become exhausting. You always feel weighed down, always feel under attack, always feel like life is an uphill battle. Not because it is, but because that's how you named it. Language becomes landscape, and you build your house inside the image you once used just to describe. Even your identity becomes metaphor. You say, I'm a black sheep, I'm a phoenix, I'm a rock. And maybe that helped you explain something. Maybe it helped you survive. But identities are rivers, not statues. And every metaphor hardens you into something smaller than you're becoming. Even in healing, metaphors confine. You hear, you have to break to grow, or you're peeling layers like an onion, or you're rewiring the brain. And maybe these help, but maybe they trap. What if you're not a broken machine? What if you're not layers to be peeled? What if you're not wiring to be fixed? What if you're something wild, ungraspable, and metaphor was never enough to hold you? This is the danger. Metaphors simplify, and simplification always leaves something behind. Reality is not a single image. It's a spectrum of vibrations too big for language. And yet, we keep trying. Because metaphor is seductive. It gives you control. It makes you feel like you know. But knowing is not truth. Knowing is only naming. And names, like cages, define by excluding. The moment you say, I am like this, you stop becoming. And the moment you say, life is like that, you stop looking deeper. So what's the answer? Maybe it's this. Use metaphor, but let it dissolve. Hold it gently. Let it guide, not dictate. Let it be a lens, not a law. When you say, I'm carrying baggage, ask, what happens if I put it down? When you say, I'm stuck in a storm, ask, what if I'm the wind? When you say, I'm broken, ask, what if I'm just unfinished? Because the truth you're looking for isn't in the image. It's in the space beyond it, beyond the wave, beyond the clock, beyond the fire, the thief, the stage. There, something waits, not to be described, but to be felt, to be lived, to be free.